For the first time in their lives, 20 people watch water flow on its own, without a lever, no bucket. An old woman drops to her knees before the barrel and touches the trickle with her finger. And 5 days ago, this world killed an orphaned boy in a dry field. And no one knows yet that a completely different person has awakened inside his body. Let's rewind. The first thing Dan feels is the taste of dead earth in his mouth, dry, cracked crust. He lies face down on the cracked field and doesn't recognize his own body. The hands are someone else's, thin, tanned to blackness. He clenches his fingers and his nails scrape against the hard clay. He lifts his head. A white sky without a single cloud. He coughs from the dust. He rolls onto his back. His heart is beating too fast for a man who is simply lying down. And then someone else's memories flooded his mind. A boy named Daniel Mercer, an orphan, 22 years old. Old Mercer Farm. A debt of 18 gold pieces, due in 4 months. He won't pay. Baron Caldwell will take the land. The boy died right here, in this field, from hunger and despair. And now another Daniel Mercer has awakened in his body, an engineer from Ohio, 27 years old, who, 4 minutes ago, saw an empty truck flying toward him. He touches a stranger's face. The cheekbones are sharper. The nose isn't his. He feels for his Adam's apple. He swallows. The Adam's apple twitches, alive. He stands up, his knees are shaking, and he starts counting. That's how he always calmed himself down. 1. The barn is tilted 12 degrees to the north. The ridge beam is rotten. 2. A well 20 paces away, a stone log cabin. The wind is blowing through it, so it must be dry. 3. A field of 1.5 hectares. The ground isn't just dry, it's dead. Nothing has grown here for 3 years. The clay has baked into stone. He exhales and speaks aloud the first word in this world. All right. He walks to the well. He drops a pebble down. He counts. 1, 2, 3. A dry thud, no splash. The well is empty. A farm without water, a field without life, a barn without a roof, debt without money, a body without strength. And this is where the strangest thing begins. Right in front of his face, a bluish panel flashes to life. It hangs in the air like a laptop screen. 2 lines. Farmer's system activated. Skill. Agricultural engineering. Rank E. Dan reaches out his hand. His fingers pass through the letters. The panel flickers but doesn't disappear. Then, as if handling a hot skillet, he mentally touches the word irrigation. And a blueprint unfolds over the field. Blue lines against a white sky, a ditch, a wooden sluice gate, slope angles, water flow calculations, everything is just like on his work computer. Only there is no computer, and no office, and no former life. There is only the drawing. And something inside clicks into place like a gear that has found its slot. He knows how to do this. A ditch, a sluice, a 2-degree slope over 10 meters. He's done this 100 times. The blueprint fades. Dan goes into the barn. Inside is worse than outside. 3 walls. The 4th has collapsed into a pile of planks. The roof gapes with a hole. On the bench, a bundle of rags, a cracked clay mug. That's all of Daniel Mercer's possessions, all that's left of his family. He unwraps the rags, a shirt, a rope, a candle stub, a dull knife with a wooden handle. But a knife. He grips the handle, his first tool. He steps outside. 3 hours until dark. He walks around the farm. Beyond the fence, a gentle slope leads down into a hollow. A dampness drifts up from there. Water. He goes down. After 300 steps, he finds a stream, narrow, barely ankle deep, but it's flowing. Dan drops to his knees and drinks greedily. Warm, it tastes of clay, but it's water. He sits down and looks. The stream below, the farm above. A 15-meter drop. Water won't flow uphill on its own. He needs a lift. He reaches for the system. The panel flashes. Water lifting mechanism. Wood, stone, rope. Minimum flow for activation, 0.3 liters per second. Dan looks at the water. He estimates. The system adds. 4 liters. Right at the limit, but it'll be enough. With these hands, he'll have to chop down trees, heave logs, chisel out the grooves. But his hands are thin, with calluses not from work, but from hunger. He speaks again. All right, and walks back. In the evening, he planes a peg in the barn by candlelight. His hands remember the movements. Not these hands, others. The ones that assembled a model water wheel out of plywood in his grandfather's garage. Wood shavings fall to the floor. The wind howls through the hole. 18 gold pieces. 4 months. A farm without water. A body without strength. But he knows one thing. He knows how to build. Morning comes with the cold. The boy's body is too thin to hold the heat. Dan gets up. Everything aches. He walks downstream toward the creek. Half a mile down, the channel narrows between 2 rocks. The water speeds up. It foams. The system ignites on its own. The optimal installation point. Efficiency is 30% higher. Here. He cuts down a young alder with a blunt knife. 20 minutes per trunk. His hands are shaking. By noon, he has 6 trunks, and he realizes he'll collapse if he doesn't eat. He finds bushes with sour berries. The system is silent. It's about engineering, not botany. He takes a risk. His stomach doesn't hurt. He chews something that looks like wild onion. Bitter, but his stomach warms up. By sunset, 12 trunks. His hands are covered in blisters. The knife is dead dull. On the way to the farm, he sees lights over the hill. A village. Hopefield. 40 households. The village elder, the blacksmith, the general store. There's food and tools there. But there are questions, too. Who is he? Why has the boy Mercer suddenly come back to life? He'll go there. But not today. At night, he stuffs his shirt with dry grass instead of a blanket. He lies there and counts the chain. Water is the key. He'll bring water to the field, grow crops, sell them, buy tools, build faster. A simple, long chain, but clear. Day 3. Assembly Day. The system unfolds the blueprint, a horizontal wheel, 8 blades at a 35-degree angle, a wooden axle, a stone bearing. He finds a smooth pebble on the shore with a natural hollow, as if someone had left it there on purpose. Dan cuts. He planes. He ties it with rope. The system points out the mistakes. The angle is wrong, the groove is too shallow, the rope will fray. He needs a double knot. By evening, he places the wheel in the narrow gap between the rocks. He secures the axle to 2 poles and holds his breath. Water hits the blades. The wheel jerks. Dan stops breathing. 1 turn. 2. The axle creaks. The bare bearing hums. The wheel runs smoothly. Slowly, but smoothly. He'd seen 1,000 such wheels in his past life, on video, in blueprints. But this is the first one he's built from scratch. Out of sticks, with a dull knife, with hungry hands. And it's turning. Now, the lever. A cam on the axle lifts the lever with every turn. The lever lifts the bucket. The bucket tips over and pours water into the trough. The trough flows by gravity to the village. Another day's work. Morning of the 4th day. Dan is carving the 2nd section of the trough when he hears footsteps. A girl is standing on the path. Short-cropped, dark blonde hair, hands covered in calluses, an apron stained with tar. She looks at the wheel, at the lever, at the trough. She is silent for a long time. Then she asks what it is. A water wheel. Why? I want to bring water to the village. She is silent for another half-minute. She says he's crazy and walks away. She returns 2 hours later, a bundle in her hands. She unwraps it and places it in front of him. 6 chisels, old ones, sharpened, with handles dark with sweat. She says that without them, he'll die here. And she tells him her name, Ella Whitfield, a carpenter's daughter. Dan runs his finger along the blade. Sharp, the first real tool in this world. He says thank you. She shrugs and walks away. But more slowly now. By evening, the pump comes to life. Dan pulls the last rope. The cam catches the lever. The bucket scoops up water. It tips over. Water splashes into the trough and runs down toward the village. A thin stream, muddy from the clay, but it flows, on its own, without a person, without magic. Just wood and the right angle. He directs the end of the trough into an old barrel by the square. The barrel had stood empty for a year. Water begins to drip, sparsely, but continuously. Dan goes to the farm and falls asleep instantly. And on the morning of the 5th day, voices wake him, many voices. And here we are, back where we started. The barrel is full to the brim. Water spills over the edge and flows over the stones of the square. 20 people stand and watch in silence. Old woman Elsa, who has carried water all her life on a yoke, is kneeling and touching the trickle with her finger. She pulls her hand away, touches it again, checks to see if she imagined it. Then she raises her head up the trough, to where, behind the hill, an invisible wheel creaks, and tears stream down her cheeks. And Dan stands at the edge of the square, dirty, exhausted, in a foreign body, with blisters on his hands, with someone else's memories, with a faintly glowing panel at the edge of his vision. And he watches as 20 people see water flowing on its own for the first time in their lives. Town Elder Harold arrived around noon. Dan had been expecting him. A large man in his 50s with a gray beard and hands that had clearly known both plow and axe. Behind him walked the blacksmith, broad-shouldered, silent, with a hammer on his shoulder. Not as a threat, out of habit. Harold stopped 3 paces from Dan. He looked at him, then at the trough, then at the hill behind which a wheel was creaking, then back at Dan. And he asked one thing. He asked who had taught him this. Dan said no one. Himself. Harold was silent for a moment. Then he asked if it was witchcraft. Dan said no. Wood, stone, rope, water flows down, the wheel turns, the lever lifts the bucket pours into the trough slopes downward. That's all. Harold looked at him for a long time, then he turned to the blacksmith. The blacksmith shrugged. Harold said he needed to think it over, and he left. The blacksmith lingered for a second. He looked at the trough. He touched the joint between the 2 sections with his finger. He shook his head, and he left too. Dan was left alone. He knew what that meant. Not hostility, not acceptance. Caution. The village saw that the water was flowing, but the village didn't understand why. And what is incomprehensible can be dangerous, especially in a world where magic exists and belongs to the nobility. Especially when a guy who'd been rotting away on an empty farm for 3 years suddenly starts doing things no one has ever seen before. Dan had to proceed with caution. No pressure, no bragging. Just do it. Results speak louder than words. He returned to the farm and began to figure out what he needed. He had water, a thin stream but a steady one. Now he had to bring it to the field. For that, he needed another trough, a long one, 30 meters, with the right slope. And he needed soil, not this dead clay. He needed to break up the crust, mix it with something, compost, manure, anything organic. The system suggested it, green manure. If he cut the grass from the banks of the stream and put it in a pit of water for 2 weeks, he'd get liquid fertilizer. Not ideal, but enough for a start. Dan dug a pit, with a knife and his hands. Chisels were too valuable for digging. The hole turned out shallow, an elbow's depth, 2 steps wide. He filled it with grass from the bank, poured water from a bucket, covered it with branches. In 2 weeks, it would be mush. Stinky, but useful. Now for the trough. He needed tree trunks, long ones, straight ones, that could be split lengthwise. He went to the woods beyond the stream. He found young ash trees, straight as poles. With chisels, the work went 3 times faster than with a knife. By the end of the day, he had 4 trunks, 3 meters long each. For a 30-meter trough, he needed 10 sections. That meant 2 more days of work. In the evening, Ella came to the farm, silently. She looked at the pit with the grass, at the trunks stacked by the barn, at Dan, who was sitting and sharpening a chisel on a stone. She asked what he was doing. He said he wanted to bring water to the field. She asked why. He explained. If the field gets water, the soil will soften. If the soil softens, it can be dug up. If we dig it up and add fertilizer, we can sow the seeds. If we sow them now, there will be a harvest in 3 months. Not a big one, but enough to pay off the debt. Ella looked at him. Then she said that he thinks like a merchant, but builds like a carpenter. It was a compliment. Dan knew this from the way she twitched the corner of her mouth, almost a smile. She left and returned an hour later with a pot of porridge. Barley. Thick. Hot. Dan ate and felt his body come alive. The first decent meal in 5 days. Ella sat next to him on a log and looked off into the distance. She was silent. Then she said her father had built all sorts of things too. He wanted a mill, a real one, with stone millstones. He'd drawn up the plans, but he didn't get the chance. He died 2 years ago. Illness. Dan stopped chewing. He asked if the plans were still there. She said yes, on a board, in the workshop. She hadn't touched them, not once in 2 years. Dan nodded. He didn't ask to see it. It was too soon. They sat in silence. The porridge was gone. Ella took the pot and left. The next day, Dan worked on the gutter. He split the logs lengthwise, with a chisel and wedges. He drove a wedge into the end, hit it with a stone. The log cracked and split into 2 halves. Then he scooped out the core. It turned into a semicircular trough, rough, but it held water. By evening on the 6th day, 4 sections were ready. He laid them out from the barrel toward the field. The water from the barrel flowed on. Through the trough, a thin stream stretched another 12 meters toward the farm. That was the beginning. On the 7th day, a boy came to him, about 10 years old, red-haired, freckled, barefoot. He stood 10 paces away and watched as Dan planed the log, silently, for an hour. Then he came closer, even closer, crouched down, watched. Dan didn't shoo him away. He kept working. The boy finally asked why the water was going up. Dan stopped. He looked at him and explained. The water doesn't go up. The wheel lifts the bucket. The bucket is just a wooden scoop on a lever. The lever is a long stick. When one end of the stick goes down, the other goes up. That's all. The boy thought. Then he asked, "And who pushes the stick down?" Dan said the wheel. The boy asked, "And who turns the wheel?" Dan said, "The water." The boy fell silent. Then his eyes grew wide. He said, "The water lifts itself up." Dan smiled. He said that was almost right. The water below helps the water rise to the top. The boy jumped up and ran off to the village. Dan heard him shouting as he ran, "The water lifts itself up." By evening, 5 men from the village were standing by the stream. They looked at the wheel. They tugged at the axle. They tugged at the lever. One tried to stop the wheel with his hand. The water pushed the blades, and the wheel kept turning. The man pulled his hand away. He looked at his palm. There was water on it. Ordinary river water. No sorcery. They left quietly. But Dan saw their faces. Something was changing. Slowly, carefully. But it was changing. On the 8th day, he finished the trough to the field. 30 meters of wooden half-pipes on poles. Water from the stream, through the wheel, through the bucket, through the barrel, through the trough, reached the edge of the dead field. A thin stream fell onto the cracked clay. The clay sizzled, like a frying pan. Dan stood and watched. The water spread out in a dark patch, slowly. The first water on this field in 3 years. The system flashed. Irrigation area, 0.2 hectares. Not enough for a full cycle. Expansion required. Dan knew that. You can't irrigate a field with just one trough. He needed a system. Branches, channels, water distribution. But that was for later. Right now, he had 2 square meters of wet soil. And that was better than nothing. He picked up a stick and began poking at the soggy clay. It gave way. Not easily, but it gave way. Beneath the crust was soil. Dark. Not quite dead. There was a chance. Ella came by in the evening. She saw the wet spot in the field. She stopped. She stood there watching the water drip from the gutter onto the ground. Then she said he needed a shovel. Dan said yes. She said she had one, her father's. She'd bring it tomorrow. Dan said thank you. She told him to stop thanking her. It was annoying, and she left. But the corner of his mouth twitched again. The 9th day, Ella brought the shovel, and a hoe, and an axe. 3 tools that cost more than everything Dan owned. She said it was a loan. When he got a job, he'd pay her back. Not with money, with work. Dan asked what kind. She said she'd see. And for the first time, she stayed. She sat on a log by the barn. She watched him dig in the soggy earth. Then she stood up. Silently, she took the hoe and began to break up the soil next to him. They worked until dark, without speaking. Shovel, hoe, shovel, hoe. The earth turned over, dark, damp, alive. By nightfall, they had a 2 by 3 meter patch of dug-up earth. Small. Ridiculous. But it was the first piece of tilled land on the old Mercer farm in 3 years. Ella stuck the hoe into the ground. She looked at Dan. She said she'd bring seeds tomorrow. Turnips. They grow fast. 60 days until harvest. Dan nodded. Turnips. Not wheat, not rye. Turnips. A poor man's vegetable. But a vegetable you can sell at the market, or trade, or just eat so you don't starve to death. He sat down on the ground next to the dug-up patch. Ella sat down beside him. They sat and looked at the wet earth in the darkness. Somewhere beyond the hill, a wheel creaked. Water dripped into a gutter, dripped from the gutter onto the field. Quietly. Steady. Uninterrupted. Ella said her father would have called him a madman. Dan asked why. She said because he was building from the end. First, water, then soil, then seeds. Normal people look for seeds first, then they think about water. Dan said that without water, seeds are just pebbles. Ella was silent for a moment. Then she said her father would have said the same thing. And she left. On the 10th day, Ella brought the seeds, a handful of small, dark grains in a rag. Turnips. They planted the plot, 2 by 3 meters. Dan made furrows with his finger, shallow ones, a centimeter. Ella scattered the seeds. They covered them with soil. They watered them from a bucket. Then Dan stood up. He looked at the planted plot, 2 by 3 meters, 6 square meters. He needed at least half a hectare to grow enough to sell. There was a chasm between 6 square meters and half a hectare. But 6 square meters was a start. The system chimed softly. Skill progress, 3% to rank D. Dan looked at the panel. End of the second week. The barn. Dan sat inside, examining the roof. A hole gaped open. You could see the stars through it. Beautiful. But the first rain would soak everything he did inside. He had to fix it. He needed boards, nails, or at least rope and branches for a temporary patch. Ella said there were boards in her father's workshop. Old ones, but sturdy. She'd help carry them. Dan said that was too much. She'd already given him tools, food, seeds. Ella looked at him. She said he was building a water pump that supplied water to the whole village. The barrel in the square never ran dry. The old women no longer went to the stream with buckets. This wasn't charity, it was an exchange. Dan opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. The next day they hauled boards from Ella's workshop. By the third week, the ground responded. Dan went out to the field in the morning and saw green. Tiny turnip sprouts had pushed through the dark, damp soil, thin as needles, pale, but alive. He crouched down, touched a sprout with his finger. Delicate, fragile, real. The system had responded. The first germination cycle is complete. Agroengineering skill, progress, 12% to rank D. Dan closed the panel and looked at the sprouts. In his past life, he'd seen this hundreds of times, in clients' fields, on his grandfather's farm. But here it was different. Here he was starting with dead soil, from scratch, with an empty well and a dull knife. And the earth responded. Ella came in for lunch. She saw the sprouts. She stopped. She stood there for a long time. Then she said quietly that she didn't believe it. Dan looked at her. She said she thought everything would rot, that the water from the gutter would be dirty, that the soil was too dead, that nothing would grow. That she'd help simply because she had nothing else to do. Dan asked, "What about now?" She looked at the sprouts. She said that now she had something to do, and she went to get a hoe. They expanded the plot. They dug up another 30 square meters. They planted seeds. The gutter couldn't handle it anymore. They needed more water. They needed a second wheel, or to improve the first one. The system suggested increase the number of blades from 8 to 12. Lengthen the lever. Put 2 buckets instead of 1. Productivity would double. Dan spent 3 days rebuilding the mechanism. Ella helped. She learned how to make wedges, quickly, smoothly. She carved with a chisel so that the shavings flew off in uniform curls. The hands of a carpenter. The new wheel with 12 blades was heavier. The axle creaked. Dan picked out a second stone bearing. He lubricated it with animal fat that Ella had brought from the village. The wheel ran more smoothly. 2 buckets scooped water in turn. The flow in the trough doubled. Dan stood and calculated. At this rate, he could cover 1/4 of a hectare if he ran a branch off the main trough, a fork, 2 arms, each to its own section of the field. He needed more wood, more logs, more time. But time was the one thing he had the least of. 3.5 months until the autumn tax. In the middle of the third week, 2 events occurred. The first, the village headman Harold came to the farm, alone, without the blacksmith. He stood by the gutter, watched the water run through the wooden half-pipes. Then he walked along the gutter to the field. He saw the sprouts. He crouched down. He touched the ground. Damp. Dark. He stood up. He looked at Dan and said he wanted to understand. Not what Dan was doing, he could see that, but how. Dan sat down on the edge of the gutter and began to explain. Simply. Slowly. As if explaining to a child. Water is heavy. It exerts pressure. If you give it away down, it will go down. If you put a wheel in its path, it will push the wheel. The wheel turns. A lever is attached to the wheel. The lever is like a stick on a rock, one end down, the other up. The lever lifts the bucket. The bucket scooped up water at the bottom and poured it out at the top. That's the whole secret. Harold listened. Then he said his grandfather used to tell stories about the ancients, that they had things like that, wheels that turned on their own. Dan tensed up. He asked what else his grandfather had said. Harold said nothing, just stories for kids. No one believed them. Then Harold paused and asked a question that left Dan at a loss. He asked if such a wheel could be set up on the stream by the mill. The village had a hand mill, stone millstones. 2 men turned the handle all day to grind a sack of flour. Their backs were breaking. People were sick. Grain was piling up because there was no one to grind it. Dan looked at Harold, then at the stream, then at the system panel, which was already displaying a blueprint of a water mill with a horizontal wheel and a belt drive to the millstones. He said it was possible, but not now. First, he needed to save the farm, then the farm. Harold nodded. He wasn't offended. He just nodded and left. But Dan noticed how he walked, faster than he had come, with his head held high. The second event of the 3rd week. Night. Dan woke up to a rustling behind the barn. He peeked out. Someone was rummaging through his pile of logs. Small, quick. Dan grabbed a stick and went out. A shadow darted toward the woods. He followed. He found her. At the edge of the woods, a girl was sitting on the ground. Small, skinny. Dark hair, tangled and dirty. Clothes in tatters. In her hands, she held 3 carrots pulled from his garden. Dan looked at her. She looked at him. Her eyes were big, frightened. But she didn't run away. She froze like a little animal. Dan lowered his stick. He asked her name. She was silent. He asked again. Something twitched on her face. She said something, quietly, quickly, with an accent Dan couldn't place. He asked her to repeat it. She said, "Ji-young." He asked where she was from. She said from the east. He asked how long she'd been here. She held up 3 fingers. 3 days. She had been living in the woods, behind his farm. 3 days, eating his carrots and berries. Dan looked at the 3 carrots in her hands. They were the size of a finger, skinny, crooked. The first harvest from his field, more precious than gold. He reached out his hand. She flinched. He said he wouldn't take them. He offered her a proper meal, porridge. There was no bread, but he'd call it porridge. Ji-young looked at him. Then she slowly stood up. She followed him to the barn. Dan lit a fire. Ella had left a pot with leftover barley porridge yesterday. He reheated it. He gave it to the girl. She ate quickly, silently, like an animal, with both hands. When she finished, she looked at the pot, empty, then at Dan, and said she could work, if he fed her. If he didn't feed her, she'd leave. Dan asked what she could do. She paused. Then she said something strange. She said that she sees something once and remembers it. Shapes, any shapes. He didn't understand. He asked what she meant by shapes. She stood up. She walked over to his table, where there were scraps of wood. And in 5 minutes, she built an exact replica of his water wheel out of splinters and twigs, with 12 blades, with an axle, with a bucket on a lever. She had seen its mechanism once, just a glimpse, when she was reaching for the carrot, and she reproduced it in miniature, without a single mistake. Dan looked at the little wheel made of splinters, then at Ji-young, then back at the wheel. Then he said, "All right, you're staying." Morning. Dan woke up and found that Ji-young was already up. She was sitting by the stream, looking at the wheel. Not just looking, studying it, head tilted, eyes narrowed. She was watching every movement of the blade, every time the bucket rose, every time the axle turned. Dan walked over. She asked why the blades were angled. He explained. If the blade is straight, the water hits it and bounces off. If it's angled, the water slides along the blade and pushes longer. More power with the same amount of water. Ji-young was silent. Then she said, "Okay, okay, okay." 3 times, just like he said, with a serious accent, not knowing what it meant. Dan almost laughed. He held it in. Ella came in for dinner. She saw Ji-young. She stopped. She looked at Dan. He said that this was Ji-young. She would be helping out. Ella looked at the girl, at her torn clothes, at her dirty hair, at the splinters sticking out of that hair. Then she said she needed to wash up. Ji-young said she had washed, yesterday, in the stream. Ella said that didn't count, and took her to the village. They returned 2 hours later, Ji-young in clean clothes. Her hair was still short and sticking out in all directions, but clean. Ella said the girl had eaten 3 servings at her house, and she described that wheel made of splinters. Ella said it was more accurate than her father's drawings. Dan nodded. Now there were 3 of them. The work went faster. Ji-young turned out to be more helpful than Dan had expected. She didn't just memorize shapes. She saw how the parts fit together. Once, Dan showed her how to make a groove in a log, with a chisel. 3 strikes, a turn, 2 strikes. Knock out the splinter. She repeated it perfectly, on the first try, without a single extra strike. Her hands moved like his hands, a carbon copy of his movements. Dan had never seen anything like it. The system didn't explain this. She needs the blueprints. Ji-young froze. She looked at him, then at the diagram, then back at him. And for the first time in all the time Dan had known her, she smiled. Not a flicker, not a twitch. She smiled for real, widely. And that smile made her face look completely different. Childlike, open, alive. Then she caught herself and hid the smile again. But Dan had seen it. The end of the 3rd week, Dan sat by the barn in the evening and took stock. The field, 80 square meters planted. The turnips have sprouted. The carrots, too. No peas yet, but it's still early. The water is flowing. 2 buckets are working around the clock. The flow is steady. We have tools. We have a team. Ella and Ji-young. The barn is repaired. There is food, meager, porridge and berries, but enough to work. Cons: 0 money. Almost no seeds left. The area is small. You need at least half a hectare to grow a marketable crop. For half a hectare, you need 10 times more water. For 10 times more water, you need a real water wheel, a big one, with a vertical axis. The blacksmith's name was Fergus. Dan learned this from Ella. Fergus Bowman, 43 years old, widowed 5 years ago. 1 son, 14 years old. A quiet, sullen man who spoke with a hammer rather than words. His smithy stood on the outskirts of the village, small, dark, with smoke always coming from the chimney, hot inside, the smell of burnt coal. An anvil sunk into the earthen floor. Fergus stood by the forge and was hammering out nails, a batch of 30, to sell in town. Every nail the same, straight, neat, the work of a master. Dan walked in and stood by the door. He waited for Fergus to finish the nail he was working on. Fergus finished. He tossed the nail into a barrel of water. A hiss. Steam. He turned to Dan, silently. Dan said he'd come to place an order. Fergus asked what. Dan said staples, 12 of them, U-shaped, for fastening logs. Fergus looked at him, asked how he'd pay. Dan said he didn't have any money, but he could offer a trade. Fergus raised an eyebrow. Dan explained. He'd seen Fergus at work, a hand hammer, heavy. Every blow takes strength from the shoulder and back. By evening, Fergus can barely straighten up. Dan could make a mechanical hammer with a pedal. Step on it and the hammer would rise. Take your foot off and the hammer would fall. A lever and a counterweight. Your back gets a rest. The work goes twice as fast. Fergus was silent for a long time. Then he said that his father had forged with a hammer, and his grandfather, like a mortar and pestle. If you find the right pair, it'll work. Not forever, but long enough for Fergus to see the results and agree to forge a proper one. Dan spent the day by the stream, looking for stones. He found a flat cobblestone with a hole, and a rounded stone that fit into the hole and turned with minimal friction. Not perfect, but it worked. 2 days to assemble. Ella helped with the wood. Ji-young tied the rope knots. A lever made of sturdy oak, 2.5 meters long. A platform for the hammer at one end, a stone counterweight at the other. In the middle, a stone pivot on a wooden support. From the short end of the lever, a rope ran to a pedal on the floor. You stepped on the pedal. The short end of the lever went down. The long end with the hammer went up. You took your foot off. The hammer fell down. A blow. That's it. Dan had assembled the contraption in the blacksmith's yard. Fergus stood in the doorway and watched, silently. Fergus's son, a 14-year-old boy, peered over his father's shoulder. Dan was finished. He checked the joints. He tugged on the lever. Everything held. He placed a piece of iron on the anvil, the one Fergus had given him for the test. He pressed the pedal. The hammer rose. The hinge creaked. Dan took his foot off. The hammer fell. The blow was dull, heavy. The iron on the anvil dented. Fergus walked over. He looked at the iron, at the hammer, at the pedal. He pressed it himself. The hammer rose easily. He took his foot off. A blow. Again. Again. He struck for 3 minutes straight. Then he stopped. He looked at his right hand, the one he'd raised with the hammer 1,000 times a day, every day, for 30 years. He looked at the pedal. His right hand was free. His back was straight. He could stand upright and guide the workpiece with both hands. Precision of the strike, control, no pain in his shoulder, no crunch in his lower back. Fergus turned to Dan, and for the first time in all the time Dan had known him, an expression appeared on his face. Not a smile. Fergus didn't know how to smile, but something close to it. He said, 20 staples, not 12. 20. And he shook Dan's hand. The blacksmith's hand squeezed his palm like a vice. Dan endured it. It was a deal. The staples were ready in 5 days. Fergus worked the foot-powered hammer and forged as many on the first day as he usually did in 3. His son couldn't stay away from the machine. He pressed the pedal when his father wasn't looking. When his father was looking, he pressed it too. Fergus scolded him, but without malice. 20 staples, heavy, smooth, with holes for wooden pins. Dan carried them to the farm in a sack and felt their weight. Iron. The first iron on his farm. Ella saw the staples and asked what they were for. Dan said they were for a wheel. She asked which one. He said the big one. The real one. The one that would draw enough water to cover half a hectare. Ella looked at him, then at the stream, then at the field, and said she needed to show him something. They went to the village, to the workshop. Ella walked over to that very board in the corner, turned it to face Dan. A drawing of a mill, her father's hand. Charcoal pencil on a planed board. A vertical wheel, an overshot mill. A millstone on a vertical axis. Transmission via wooden gears. Everything was drawn neatly, with dimensions, with notes. Dan looked. Ella's father knew what he was doing. The design was sound. Almost. There were 2 mistakes. The gears were too thin for the load. They'd crack in a month. And the millstone's axis wasn't centered. The runout would destroy the bearing in a week. But the foundation, the idea, the proportions, everything was right. The man who drew this understood mechanics, not from books, from feel, from a craftsman's intuition. Ella stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her. Her knuckles were white. She was waiting. Dan turned to her. He said her father was right about almost everything. Ella pressed her lips together. Dan said there were two places that needed fixing, but the foundation was magnificent. If he had the time, he would build it. Ella didn't answer. Dan paused. Then he said, "Let's finish it. Together." She stood motionless. Then something in her face flinched. She turned away. Her shoulders trembled. Dan stood and waited. He didn't touch her. He didn't say a word. A minute later, she turned back. Her eyes were red, dry. She ran her hand over her face. She said she'd be ready tomorrow, and she left the workshop. Dan was left alone. He looked at the blueprint, at the neat lines drawn by the hand of a dead man. Then he mentally superimposed the system's grid over the blueprint. The panel lit up. Structural analysis, compatibility, 78%. Recommended modifications, double the thickness of the gears. Shift the axis 4 centimeters toward the center. Add iron brackets at the points of maximum load. Estimated service life after modifications, 3 years minimum. Dan saved the modifications in the system's memory. Tomorrow he would redraw the blueprint, with the modifications, but in such a way that the foundation remained, so that it would be her father's mill, not his. The next day, Ella arrived at the farm at dawn, with an axe, with a handsaw, which, judging by the rust, hadn't been used in a year. She said we'd start with the wood. Dan showed her the revisions on the parchment, carefully, next to the original lines, not over them, next to them. Ella watched. Her finger traced the line of the gear, her father's, then the line of the correction, Dan's. She said her father had said the gears were a bit too thin, but he didn't have any iron for staples and he hoped the wood would hold. Dan said they had the iron, 20 staples. Ella looked at him, nodded. They went to cut down the forest. Ji-young went with them. She carried the rope and chisels. On the way, she asked what a mill was. Dan explained, a big wheel that turns a stone. The stone grinds the grain into flour. Ji-young asked why. You can eat the grain whole. Ella looked at her and said, Have you ever eaten white bread? Ji-young shook her head. Ella said that once she tried it, she'd understand why. They cut down trees for 3 days. They chose straight oaks, thick ones, strong ones. For the axle, they needed a trunk 20 centimeters in diameter, straight, without knots. They found one like that on the second day. Ella said it was a good tree. Her father had had his eye on it while he was still alive, but he didn't make it in time. The 3 of them felled it. Ella chopped, Dan guided, Ji-young pulled away the branches. The tree fell exactly where they wanted it to. Ella knew how to fell a tree, a carpenter's touch. Dan watched her. She stood over the fallen oak with an axe in her hand, sweaty, breathing heavily. Her hair stuck to her forehead, and there was an expression on her face he hadn't seen before, something fierce and alive, as if something inside her had been lit that had been extinguished for 2 years. She was building, again, just like her father used to. And it changed in her. Something important. Dan turned away. He picked up the saw and began sawing the trunk to the right length. Along with preparing the lumber, Dan continued to expand the field. The water flowed steadily, the sprouts were growing stronger. The turnips had already produced their first real leaves. The carrots were starting to grow. The peas had finally sprouted. Dan walked between the rows and looked at the greenery. Greenery on a field that had been barren for 3 years. The system noted the progress. Agricultural engineering skill, 42% to rank D. Meanwhile, Ji-young was settling in. She slept in the barn. Dan fenced off a corner for her with planks. He laid down some dry grass. She curled up there like a cat and fell asleep instantly. In the morning, she was the first to get up. She walked to the stream. She checked the wheel. She tightened the ropes if they had loosened. She cleared the blades of twigs and leaves, without being told, on her own. She had taken the mechanism as her own. Once, Dan saw her sitting by the wheel, talking to it, quietly, in her own language. He didn't ask what about. In the middle of the 4th week, the first trouble came. In the morning, Dan discovered that the upper section of the gutter had been knocked off, not by the wind. Footprints. Someone's boots on the wet ground around the pole. Someone had come by during the night and struck the gutter with a stick or a foot. The half-pipe had cracked. Water was flowing past it. Dan stood and watched. Ella came over. She saw it. She turned pale. She said it was Greg Tolden, the moneylender's son, to whom the Mercer farm owed 4 gold pieces out of those 18. Greg hated Dan. Not personally, on principle. If Dan got the farm back on its feet and paid the debt, the moneylender would lose his claim to the land, and the land had been promised to Greg as a dowry for his marriage to the miller's daughter from town. Dan fixed the gutter in half a day. He installed a new section, stronger than the old one, with double fastenings, a bracket and a rope. Ella offered to keep watch at night. Dan said it wasn't necessary. If Greg wants to break it, let him break it. Dan will fix it. And every time, he'll fix it faster than Greg breaks it. Because breaking is easy. Building is hard. But whoever builds wins in the end. Ella looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was strange. Dan said it wasn't the first time he'd heard that. Ella almost smiled. The gutter wasn't broken anymore. Maybe Greg got scared. Maybe he got tired. Or maybe Fergus the blacksmith had a word or two with him. Dan saw Fergus talking to Greg at the market, quietly, close up, with his hand on Greg's shoulder, the very same hand that bent iron. Greg turned pale and walked away. Fergus returned to his stall, and he didn't say a word to Dan. But the trough was standing. The end of the first month. Dan stood on the bank of the stream and looked at the clearing they had cleared for the water wheel. Level, tamped down. Stakes driven into the edges for supports. Logs prepared, hewn, numbered with charcoal. The staples were laid out. The blueprint had been transferred from the board to 3 pieces of parchment, with corrections, with dimensions, with assembly instructions. Ella stood nearby. Ji-yong sat on a log and was planing a blade for the wheel, an exact copy of the model Dan had made, down to the millimeter. The system showed progress. Agricultural engineering skill, 61% to rank D. Dan looked at the site. Assembly would begin tomorrow. His first real water wheel, with iron brackets, with proper bearings, with a transmission. Not a toy made of sticks and string. A real machine, one that would change everything. He looked up at the sky. Assembling the wheel took 8 days. Each of those days began before dawn and ended in darkness. Day 1. Supports. 2 3-meter-tall posts, oak. Dan dug them 1.5 feet into the ground on both banks of the stream. Ella packed the soil around them. Stones, clay, water, more stones, more clay. The posts had to bear the weight of the wheel and the pressure of the water. Dan checked each post personally. He pushed against them with his shoulder. He kicked the base. They didn't budge. Day 2. The axle. That very oak trunk, 20 centimeters in diameter, straight, no knots. Ella trimmed it so the surface was smooth. Ji-yong carved out the grooves for the spokes, 8 of them, evenly spaced around the circumference. Dan marked them out using the system. Each groove was exactly 45 degrees from the next. Ji-yong looked at the markings once and then cut without a ruler. Precisely. Every groove is identical. Day 3. Spokes. 8 1-meter-long oak dowels, from the axle to the rim.
each inserted into a groove and secured with a wedge, an iron clamp over the wedge. Days 4 and 5, the rim, the most difficult part. A round rim made of bent strips. Dan bent them with steam. Ella demonstrated the method her father had taught her. A pit with coals, wet boards on top. Steam rises and softens the wood.
Then quickly onto the template. Clamp it down, let it cool. The strip takes the curve. 16 strips for a full rim. 3 broke while bending, had to start over. Dan gritted his teeth. Ella silently prepared new ones. Ji-young watched the process and, after the 3rd attempt, suggested a change. She said they needed to soak the wood longer, not 10 minutes but 20. She had seen how the fibers behaved. The ones soaked for 10 minutes broke when bent. The ones soaked for 20 minutes bent like a rope. Dan listened. They stopped breaking. Day 6. Buckets. 20 wooden buckets along the rim. Each held half a bucket of water. Ji-young carved them all identical, like carbon copies. Dan secured them to the rim with clamps. Ella checked every attachment. She tugged on them. If there was even the slightest wobble, they'd redo it. Ella was stricter than Dan about this. He was willing to leave it if the wobble was minimal. She wasn't. She said her father always told her that a minimal wobble becomes a major one after a month. Dan didn't argue. Day 7. Bearings. This is where Dan spent the most time. The stone bearings made from river stones he'd picked out for the small wheel worked. But for the big one, he needed something more reliable. He asked Fergus for 2 pieces of iron, flat ones, with holes. Fergus made them in half a day, iron on iron, with a layer of animal fat. The glide was 5 times better than stone on stone. The axle in the iron bearings rotated with almost no friction. Dan turned it by hand and listened. A quiet, steady hum. No squeak, no creak. The right sound. The 8th day, installation. The 3 of them lifted the wheel onto the supports, or rather, the 5 of them. Fergus showed up on his own, uninvited, with his son. He saw that the 3 of them were lifting a wheel 2 meters in diameter and weighing 200 kilograms, and silently stood beside them. His son did too. 5 pairs of hands, ropes, a lever. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, the axle settled into the bearings at the tops of the support posts. The wheel hung over the water. Dan checked the height. The lower buckets were supposed to go 1/3 of the way into the water, no more, no less. The system confirmed it. Optimal immersion, 32%. He raised the upper trough, the very one that directed water to the upper buckets. The upper wheel didn't operate from below like its smaller counterpart, but from above. Water poured from above into the buckets. The buckets filled up and pulled the rim down. The wheel turned. This principle was more efficient, more power with the same flow. To bring water up, Dan used a long wooden chute from a spot higher up the stream where there was a small drop. A natural waterfall, half a meter high. He directed the water from there through the trough to the top of the wheel. Everything was ready. Ella stood on the right, Ji-young on the left, Fergus behind him. His son sat on a rock, watching with his mouth agape. Dan lifted the flap on the upper trough. Water gushed out. It hit the first bucket. The bucket filled up. It grew heavy. It went down. The next bucket caught the flow. It filled up. It grew heavy. It went down. The wheel trembled. It shifted slowly. The axle creaked. The iron bearings hummed with a low, steady sound. The wheel started turning. 1 revolution in 6 seconds. Slowly, powerfully, heavily. Water poured from the lower buckets back into the stream. The upper ones filled. The wheel didn't stop. Dan stood and watched. 2 meters in diameter, 20 buckets, oak spokes, iron brackets, stone supports. It was working. Ella stood nearby, and her hand slowly rose to her mouth. She bit the knuckle of her index finger, a habit Dan had seen her do when she was trying not to show what she was feeling. Jiong said, "Okay, okay," quietly, almost in a whisper. Fergus was silent. Then he turned and walked away, without a word. His son ran after him, glancing back at the wheel every 3 steps. Dan connected the wheel to the lifting mechanism, the drive shaft, from the wheel's axle to the vertical shaft. Wooden gears, the very same ones, based on Ella's father's blueprint, with Dan's modifications, thickened, on iron brackets. The teeth interlocked. The vertical shaft turned. At its upper end, a cam. The cam lifted the rocker arm. At one end of the rocker arm, a large bucket. At the other, a counterweight. The bucket lowered into the stream. It filled up. The cam lifted it. The bucket tipped over and poured the water into a collection trough. The trough led to the farm. Capacity. Dan did the math. 1 wheel rotation in 6 seconds, 10 revolutions per minute. Every 10th revolution, the cam lifted the bucket. 1 bucket per minute, 60 buckets per hour, 1,400 buckets per day. That was enough to irrigate half a hectare, with room to spare. The system chimed. Agricultural engineering skill, rank D. Progress, 0% to rank C. Dan looked at the panel. Rank D, first promotion. New modules. A windmill. No, too soon. A simple horizontal drive grain mill. Yes, that's what he needed. A water-lifting wheel with buckets for deep wells. That'll come in handy too. A manual poultry incubator. Maybe later. Dan closed the panel. He looked at the wheel. It was turning. Smoothly. Continuously. Day and night, without a person. Without magic. Without fatigue. Just water. Just wood. Just iron. Just the right calculations. By evening that same day, people had gathered by the stream. Not 5, not 10. The whole village. Someone had told them. Someone had seen it. Someone had heard the bearings hum. They stood along the bank and watched, in silence. The wheel turned. The buckets filled. The water rose. It flowed down the trough to the farm. A 2-meter wooden wheel with iron brackets. The first real machine Hopefield had seen in 100 years. Maybe 200, maybe 1,000. Old woman Elsa stood in front of everyone. She watched. She wasn't crying this time. She just watched, with an expression Dan couldn't read. Town elder Harold stood next to her. He crossed his arms over his chest. He was silent. But Dan saw how he was looking, not at the wheel, at the water, at how it rose, how it flowed down the gutter, upward, toward the field, toward the farm, toward life. Harold was thinking about the mill. Dan could see it in his eyes. Standing next to Harold was a man of about 35. Dan didn't know him. Thin, in worn-out clothes, with a little boy in his arms. The man looked at the wheel and then turned to Harold. He said quietly that if Mercer's boy could do that with water, could he do the same with his field? His field was 2 yards from Dan's farm, also dry, also dead. His wife was sick. His son was small. He couldn't manage. Harold looked at the man, then at Dan. Dan had heard. He walked over, asked where the field was. The man pointed, to the north, beyond the hill. Dan asked if there was water nearby. The man said a stream ran 100 paces away. But it was far, too far for buckets with a sick wife and a small child. Dan said that 100 steps isn't far. It's 1 trough. The man looked at him, didn't understand. Dan explained, a wooden trough, like the one that runs to his farm. 100 steps, 10 sections, 3 days' work, and there would be water in his field. No buckets, no back-breaking labor, all on its own. The man stood there, his mouth slightly open. The
The boy in his arms was asleep. The man said he had no money, nothing at all, just his hands. Dan said that his hands were enough. "Help me cut down the trees and hew the logs. I'll show you how." The man blinked. Then he nodded, quickly, several times in a row. Ella stood behind Dan. He couldn't see her face, but he heard her exhale quietly. That evening, Dan sat by the barn. Ji-young was sleeping inside. Ella had gone home. He was alone. He looked at the stars. He counted in his head, 1 trough for a man with a sick wife. 3 days. But those were 3 days he wouldn't be spending on his field, on his harvest, on his debt. The 18 gold pieces hadn't gone anywhere. 3.5 months had become 3. Time was running out. Every day counted.
And he had just promised 3 days to a stranger. Why? Because the boy was sleeping in his father's arms, because his wife was sick, because the field was dead, because he could help. And when you can help and don't, what kind of engineer are you? Mrs. Hadley was expecting the blueprint on Monday. He didn't make it. He died. And all he remembered in that last second was that he hadn't finished the blueprint. He hadn't helped. Now he could, and he would help, even if it took 3 days, even if it was foolish. The system flickered quietly at the edge of his vision. Agricultural engineering skill, rank D, 0% to rank C. Dan closed his eyes. Tomorrow he had to expand the field to 1/2 hectare, connect a new wheel to the water distribution system, mark out the channels, plan the branching, and find seeds. Lots of seeds. Turnips and wouldn't cover 18 gold pieces. He needed wheat or rye, something grain-like, something he could grind into flour and sell. For that, he needed a mill. For the mill, he needed a wheel. He had a wheel. Now he needed millstones. And millstones are stone. Heavy, solid, the right shape. He had to find a stone, carve it out, transport it, set it up. A month's work, at least. 3 months until the tax deadline. Dan did the math. If he planted 1/2 hectare of rye right now, there would be a harvest in 70 days. Rye isn't wheat. It has a short growing cycle, undemanding, grows in poor soil. If the field gets enough water, it will yield 20 sacks. If 20 sacks are ground into flour, that makes 15 sacks of flour. A sack of flour costs 1.5 gold pieces at the market. 15 sacks is 22 gold pieces, minus 4 for seeds and expenses, 18. Exactly 18. It'll be enough, just barely. No margin, no room for error, but it'll be enough. If everything goes according to plan. If there are no frosts. If the pests don't eat it all. If the millstones don't crack. If the wheel doesn't break. If the baron doesn't arrive before autumn. A lot of ifs. Too many. But he had no other options. Dan opened his eyes. He looked at the wheel in the darkness. Its silhouette stood out against the starry sky. A dark circle, turning slowly. With a faint creak from the axle. With a splash of water in the buckets. Copefield's first machine. His machine. He built it. Out of sticks, out of stones. The next morning, Dan kept his word. He took an axe and went to the farm of the man with the sick wife. The man's was named Tom Hazel. His field was as dead as Dan's had been a month ago. A dry crust. Cracks. Not a blade of grass. Dan walked along the edge and counted the steps to the stream. 112. Not 100. But the difference was small. The stream was wider here than at Dan's farm, and a little deeper, a good flow. The system had drawn up the plan, a simple gravity-fed trough from a point upstream where the bank was level with Tom's field. No wheel, no need. Here the terrain did the work itself. Water from above, field below, slope, trough. That's all. Tom stood nearby, the boy in his arms, his wife in the house.
Dan could hear her coughing behind the closed door, a dry, heavy cough. Tom said she'd been sick since spring. A doctor in town costs 5 gold pieces. They didn't have 5 gold pieces. They didn't even have one. Dan didn't say everything would be all right. He didn't know. Instead, he said they'd get started. Tom handed the boy to a neighbor. He picked up the axe. They went to cut down the forest. Tom worked silently and doggedly, not quickly, but without stopping. Hands accustomed to hard labor. It's just that this labor had never yielded results before. Because hauling buckets 112 paces and watering a dead field 1 bucket at a time isn't labor. It's punishment. Ella arrived around noon, uninvited, with a saw. Ji-young came next, with a rope and chisels. Tom looked at them, then at Dan. Dan shrugged. The 4 of them worked together. By evening on the first day, 6 sections were ready. On the second day, 5 more. On the third, Dan laid the last section and brought it to the edge of Tom's field. He opened the valve at the top end of the gutter. The water started flowing. It ran down the wooden half-pipes, 112 steps in 3 minutes. A thin, even stream fell onto the dry earth. Tom stood and watched. Then he dropped to his knees. He touched the wet earth. He picked up a clump of mud. He squeezed it in his fist. The mud squeezed out between his fingers. Wet. Alive. He sat like that for a minute. Then he stood up. He looked at Dan. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. Once. Deeply. Like a bow. Dan nodded back. He returned to his farm. 3 days wasted. 3 days he didn't have.
But as he walked back past the village, he noticed that people were looking at him differently. Not with suspicion, not with curiosity, with something else. Old woman Elsa was standing by a barrel in the square, and when he walked past, she said one word. "Thank you." Not to him personally, into the air, but he heard it. The system flashed. Agricultural engineering skill, 2% to rank C. 2% for 3 days of work in someone else's field. Dan stopped. He thought. The system wasn't just counting his farm. It counted everyone he fed, every yard that received water through his structures, every person, every sprout. Scale. The system grew from scale. That changed everything. He came to the farm, sat down by the barn. Ji-young was already there, carving something out of a scrap, another miniature. This time, a mill, with millstones, with gears, with a hopper. She'd made it out of twigs and straws. Dan looked at the miniature, then at Ji-young. He asked how she knew what a mill looked like. She said she'd seen one once, in the city, through a window. The miller wouldn't let her in. She peeked through a crack, just once, for 3 seconds, and she remembered everything. Dan picked up the miniature. He turned it over in his hands. The gears were right. The hopper was right. There was even a grain hopper. He set the miniature on the ground. He said she needed a textbook, a real one, with diagrams, no letters. Ji-young looked at him and said, Okay. Dan laughed this time. He couldn't help himself. She didn't understand why and frowned. He said those were good words. She asked what they meant. He said they meant everything would be all right. She thought for a moment and said she'd say them more often then. Seeds. That was the main problem. Turnips and carrots were growing. Peas were stretching upward. But there were no grains, no rye, no wheat, no barley. For 18 gold coins, they needed flour. For flour, they needed grain. For grain, they needed seeds. And seeds cost money, which they didn't have. Dan went to the market in Hopefield. Wednesday, market day. 5 stalls. An old man with vegetables, a woman with eggs, a boy with bundles of firewood, and a merchant from town with a sack of rye seeds. Dan approached. He asked the price.
The merchant said 2 gold pieces for a sack. 1 sack would be enough for 1/4 of a hectare.
For half a hectare, he'd need 2 sacks, 4 gold pieces. Dan had none. He stood in front of the sack of seeds and thought. The merchant waited. Then he lost interest and turned away. Dan headed back. On the way, Harold stopped him. The village elder asked if he had found the seeds. Dan said he had found them but couldn't buy them. Harold was silent for a moment. Then he said something strange. He said the village had a communal granary. It held a grain reserve in case of famine, 3 sacks of rye. The village elder could lend him 1 sack until fall, in exchange for the future harvest, if Dan returned 2 sacks instead of 1 after the tithe. Dan looked at Harold. It was a risk for the village headman. The communal grain was sacred. If Dan didn't return it, Harold would be held accountable to the village, with his reputation, with his head. Dan asked why. Harold said the barrel in the square hadn't been emptied in a month. For the first time in 3 years, his wife wasn't going to the stream with the yoke. Her knees hurt. Every trip was torture. Now she draws water in the square, 20 paces from home. And every evening she tells Harold that Mercer is a good man. Every evening, for a month. Harold said his wife was never wrong about people, not once in 30 years. Dan picked up a sack of rye, heavy, 30 kilograms. He carried it on his back to the farm. His back ached, but inside he felt warm, not from the load, from trust. Sowing half a hectare took 2 days. Dan divided the field into strips. Between the strips were channels from the main gutter. Water was distributed throughout the plot, evenly, smoothly. Each furrow got its share. He sowed by hand, by the handful, just as they sowed 1,000 years ago. The system showed the optimal density, 30 grams per square meter. He measured by eye. But an engineer's eye is more precise than it seems. Ella helped. She walked beside him, covering the seeds with soil. Ji-young walked behind and tamped the soil down with her feet. 3 people, half a hectare, 2 days. When they finished, Dan stood at the edge of the field and looked at the even, dark strips of sown land. Between them, threads of water glistened in the canals. The system displayed the forecast. At the current irrigation level and in the absence of abnormal conditions, the expected harvest in 70 days. 22 sacks of rye. Dan exhaled. 22 sacks. If everything goes right. Now the mill. He needed millstones, stone ones, round, heavy. The lower one stationary, the upper one rotating. The grain between them. The grain is ground into flour. Simple. But the stone has to be special. Dense. Grainy. Not too smooth, or the grain will slip and won't get ground. Not too rough, or stone grit will end up in the flour. The system showed the ideal type. PE sandstone. Dense, fine-grained sandstone. Dan asked Ella where there was sandstone in the area. She said there was a hill east of the forest. The rock outcrops there. Her father used to go there. He wanted to carve millstones. He didn't get the chance. Dan went to the hill. 1, a 2-hour walk through the forest. The hill turned out to be low, gentle. On the northern slope, an outcrop of rock, yellow-gray sandstone. Dan touched it, tapped it. Solid, fine-grained, just what he needed. He selected 2 blocks, each about 60 centimeters in diameter, 15 centimeters thick. Now he had to cut them out of the slope, bring them to the farm, and shape them into round discs. It took 4 days to cut them out. Dan worked alone, with a chisel that Fergus had forged in exchange for a sketch of a simple well gate. He struck the stone from morning till night. His hands went numb. By evening, his fingers wouldn't straighten. Stone dust clogged his nose and throat. He coughed. He spat out gray saliva. But he kept striking. The system showed the fracture lines. Where to place the chisel, at what angle, with how much force. Without it, he would have crumbled the stone on the first day. With it,
Every blow was precise. The first block came loose on the third day. Dan rolled it out of the outcrop, heavy, 80 kilograms, maybe 90. The second block on the fourth, now for transport. 2 stones weighing 80 to 90 kilograms each. A 2-hour trek through the forest. Carrying them was impossible. Rolling them was an option, but slow. Dan returned to the farm. He thought about it for a day. Then he built a sled. 2 long poles, a platform made of planks between them, a rope harness. 2 people could pull it. He called Tom Hazel. Tom came, no questions asked. They harnessed themselves and started pulling. It took 5 hours to drag the first stone.
Through the woods along the path Dan had cleared the day before. The second stone, the next day. 4 hours. The path was already well trodden. The stones lay in the farmyard, gray, heavy, rough. They needed to be turned into millstones, round, with grooves to carry away the flour, with a hole in the center of the top one to feed the grain. It was the work of a sculptor, not an engineer. But the system helped. A drawing of the millstone with the grooves marked out, the angle of the groove, depth, width, the distance between the grooves. Dan chiseled the stone with a chisel and a hammer, slowly, millimeter by millimeter. Dust, tap, dust, tap. Ji-young sat nearby and watched. An hour later she asked for a second chisel. Dan gave it to her. She began chiseling the second stone, repeating his movements, blow after blow. A copy. Her stone turned out smoother than his, because she wasn't thinking about what she was doing. She was simply copying. And the copy was perfect. The millstones were ready in a week. 2 stone discs, 60 centimeters, grooves, a hole in the center of the top one. Dan placed one on top of the other. He turned the top one. The stones rubbed against each other with a characteristic rustling sound. Smoothly, without jamming. He tossed a pinch of grain between them. He turned it. Coarse grits spilled out from under the lower millstone. Not flour yet, coarse, but heading in the right direction. It needed more revolutions, faster, more powerful. For that, he needed a drive from the water wheel. Horizontal rotation of the wheel into vertical rotation of the millstone. Gears, a shaft. Ella's father's blueprint with revisions. Dan looked at the stones, then at the wheel by the stream, then at the space between them where the mill was to stand. 30 paces. He needed a shaft, a long one, or a shorter one if he moved the millstones closer to the wheel. He chose the latter. He built a shed by the stream, next to the wheel. He set up the millstones under the shed. The drive from the wheel to the millstone via 2 pairs of wooden gears. The first pair converted horizontal rotation into vertical rotation. The second tripled the speed. The wheel made 10 revolutions per minute. The millstone, 30. 30 revolutions are enough for coarse grinding. For fine flour, 60 are needed. But coarse flour is flour too. It's worth money as well. Assembling the transmission took 5 days. The hardest part was cutting the gears. The wooden teeth had to mesh perfectly. No play, no jamming. The system showed the shape of each tooth, an involute profile. Dan explained to Ella what an involute was. He said it was like unwinding a rope from a spool and tracing where the end goes. The line it draws is the involute. Ella listened. Then she said her father called it a cat's tooth because it looks like one. Dan looked at the profile. It really did look like a cat's tooth. Curved, sharp at the base, rounded at the end. He smiled and said that cat's tooth was a great name. Ella almost smiled back. Ji-young immediately called the gear a cat. The whole thing. From now on, in her vocabulary, a gear was a cat. The cat turns the cat, and the cat turns the stone. Logical. The final day. Everything assembled. The gears are in place. The shaft is connected. The millstones are installed. The grain hopper on top, the flour chute below. Dan stood in front of the mill, Ella beside him.
Ji-young crouched by the gears. She was checking the teeth. He lifted the damper. The wheel turned. The gear meshed.
The first gear turned. The second caught up. The vertical shaft started moving. The millstone wobbled. It began to turn. Slowly. Then faster. Stone against stone. The rustling became a steady hum. Dan poured a handful of rye into the hopper. The grains rolled down the chute toward the hole in the center of the upper millstone. They fell between the stones. The millstone spun, the stones ground, and from beneath the lower millstone down the chute flowed down the chute. A thin, steady stream, grayish-white, coarse, but flour. Real flour. No man, no horse, no magic. Just water turning the wheel turning the gears. Word of the mill spread in 2 days, not just around the village, throughout the county. Hopefield was small, but merchants passed through it on their way to and from the city. One of them saw the mill. He stopped. He watched for 10 minutes. Then he rode on. A week later, the 3 neighboring villages and the town all knew about the young man, Mercer, who had built a wheel that ground grain on its own. Dan had no time for rumors. The rye on half a hectare had sprouted, a green strip on black soil, visible from afar. People came to look at it. They stood on the path and gazed in silence. A green field in the middle of a drought. All the neighboring fields were yellow or brown, dry, dead. But Mercer's field was green because of the water, because of the canals, because the wheel kept turning and wouldn't stop. 5 weeks after sowing, the rye was knee-high, thick, even, dark green. Dan walked between the rows and checked. The system showed the soil's condition: moisture, acidity, nutrient content. A bit low, needs fertilizing. He used that very same pit of fermented grass, the stinking green slurry, diluted it with water, 1 to 10, poured it into the canals. 3 days later, the rye shot up. The system noted the growth, 12% higher than expected. Good. The mill ran every day. Until he had his own grain, Dan milled for the village, for free. Whoever brought their grain received flour. 1 handful out of 10 remained with Dan, the miller's share. An ancient tradition. No one argued. In the first week, 100 kilograms of grain passed through the mill. 10 kilograms of flour remained with Dan. Not much, but it was income. The first income in all time in this world. Ella said they needed to think about storage. Flour spoils from moisture. They needed a dry chest. Dan said he would build one. Later. Right now, other things were more important. He needed to prepare for the visit. He knew the visit was coming. Too much noise, too much attention. Baron Caldwell couldn't help but find out. The visit came in the 6th week. Not the Baron himself. The manager, a man named Reginald Pratt, stern, tall, in a black doublet, with a notebook in his hands, with 2 guards behind him. He arrived in the morning, stood in the middle of the farmyard, looked around, saw the barn, repaired, the roof, the whole thing, the field, green, the gutter, working, the wheel by the stream, turning, the mill under the canopy, humming. And Dan, standing by the mill with his hands in the flour. Pratt opened his notebook. He said he was acting on behalf of Baron Oswald Caldwell, that the old Mercer farm owed 18 gold pieces, that the payment was due with the autumn tax, that the Baron was willing to offer to buy the farm early for 10 gold pieces, thereby settling the debt. In short, Farmer Mercer would receive 10 gold pieces. The Baron would receive the farm. Everyone was satisfied. Dan listened, silently. He wiped his hands on his pants. He looked at Pratt. Then he said no. Pratt raised an eyebrow. He jotted something down. He asked if Farmer Mercer realized that if the debt wasn't paid by the autumn tax, the land would be confiscated. Dan said he did.
Pratt asked on what basis Farmer Mercer expected to pay 18 gold pieces with half a hectare of rye and a homemade mill. Dan looked at him, then at the field. Then he said on the basis of math. Half a hectare would yield 20 sacks. The mill would grind them into 15 sacks of flour. A sack of flour was worth 1.5 gold pieces. 15 sacks is 22 gold pieces, minus 4 for expenses. 18. Exactly. Pratt took notes. Then he looked up. And for the first time during the entire conversation, his expression changed. Slightly, barely noticeably. It resembled interest. He asked who had taught Farmer Mercer to count so quickly. Dan said life. Pratt closed his notebook. He said he would pass the answer on to the Baron, and he left. The guards followed him. Dan stood and watched them go. Ella came out from behind the mill. She had been hiding, not out of fear,
Out of anger. Dan saw her knuckles turn white on the axe handle. She said that Pratt would return, and not alone. Dan said he knew. Ella said that the last time the Baron wanted the Tolden farm, he sent men at night. They set the barn on fire. The Tolden family sold it the next day. Dan looked at her, then at the barn, then at the mill, then at the field of rye. Everything he had built in 2 months. Wood. Wood burns. He stood there thinking. Then he turned toward the stream, toward the upper pond, a small natural depression upstream where water pooled before the drop. He looked at the distance from the pond to the farm. 100 paces. The drop in elevation. 10 meters. Water pressure. He began to calculate. If he ran a covered trough from the pond, a pipe, a wooden pipe, sloped with a damper, and lead the end of the pipe to the barn roof, or over the yard, or over the field, the pressure at the outlet would be enough to shoot a stream 5 meters like a fire hose. Primitive, weak, but enough to knock a torch out of someone's hand, to douse a starting fire, to drench a person from head to toe. The system unfolded the blueprint. A water defense line, a closed wooden pipeline, a damper on a rope. He pulled the rope and the water flowed. He let go and it stopped. Dan didn't tell Ella exactly what he was building. He said he was improving the irrigation system. She looked at him, then at the pipe that ran not to the field but to the barn. And she didn't ask anything. Building the pipeline took 4 days. Dan made the pipe out of 2 hollowed-out halves of a tree trunk, tied together with rope and coated with resin. Ella fetched the resin from the tanner on the edge of the village. The seal wasn't perfect. It dripped. But the main flow went through. Dan ran a test at night when no one was watching. He pulled the rope. The valve opened. A jet shot out from the end of the pipe over the yard. Not powerful, but it hit the target 3 meters away. Water flooded the yard. Dan closed the valve. He stood in the puddle. He looked at the pipe. He said quietly, "All right. Let them come." Meanwhile, life in the village was changing. Tom Hazel had plowed his field. He'd planted it. Water from Dan's gutter was watering his plot around the clock. The sprouts were coming up. Tom's wife was still coughing, but Tom said she'd started eating more. Fresh turnips from his field. The first food he'd grown himself in 2 years. 2 more neighbors came to Dan, a farmer named Alden and his brother. They asked if they could run water to their fields. Dan said yes, if they helped with the forest. They helped. In 3 days, 2 new ditches stretched out to 2 new fields. The water flowed. Greens appeared a week later. The system noted it. Agricultural engineering skill, 19% to rank C. Dan calculated. 5 farms were getting water from his system. His farm, Tom's, Alden's brothers, and a shared barrel in the square. 5 points. 1 stream, 1 wheel. The wheel was working at full capacity. The mill took up part of the power. Irrigation took up the other part. If he connected 2 more yards, there wouldn't be enough power. He needed a second wheel, or to enlarge the first one.
Dan chose the second wheel. Further down the stream, where the current was wider, this wheel would work only for the mill, the first one only for irrigation, load sharing. She came in a light-colored dress, with embroidery along the hem, her hair tucked under a sun hat. Her skin was pale, too pale for the village. Her hands were clean.
Her nails were neat, not a single callus. Everything about her screamed that she wasn't from around here. Merivale Caldwell stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the mill, at the wheel, at the troughs, at the green field of rye behind the barn, at Dan, who was standing knee-deep in the ditch clearing a clogged channel. Dirty, wet, with clay on his face. She said she had come on her uncle's behalf. Baron Caldwell wanted to know the details of the machinery on the Mercer farm. She was to inspect it and write a report. Dan climbed out of the ditch, wiped his hands on his pants, looked at her, then said, "All right." She could look at whatever she wanted. He wouldn't get in her way. Merivale walked along the gutter, slowly, carefully, trying not to get her dress dirty. She ran her fingers along the wooden joints, peered inside the gutter, looked at the water. She walked up to the wheel, stood there watching it turn. Her face was inscrutable. Dan didn't follow her. He was working, cleaning the canal. Ella was in the village. Ji-young was sitting by the mill, planing a new blade for the spare set. Merivale walked around the entire farm, the field, the mill, the barn. She returned to Dan. She stood in silence. Then she asked one thing. She asked why the water in the trough didn't flow straight, but slightly at an angle. Dan looked at her. It wasn't the kind of question someone who had come to spy would ask. It was the question of someone who was genuinely curious. He said the trough didn't run straight because the direct path went through a rocky area. They had to go around it. But the slope was maintained, 2 degrees for every 10 meters. The water doesn't notice that the path is curved, it only feels the slope. Merivale listened. Then she asked why exactly 2 degrees, not 3, not 1. Dan climbed out of the ditch. He walked over to her. He picked up a stick. He crouched down and began drawing on the ground. If it's 1 degree, the water flows too slowly. It stagnates. Algae, mud, rubbish. If 3 degrees, it's too fast. The water erodes the bottom of the gutter. In a month, the gutter will spring a leak. 2 degrees is the balance. Fast enough so it doesn't stagnate, slow enough so it doesn't destroy. He drew lines, angles, arrows. He explained. As he would explain to a colleague, without condescension, without oversimplification, just clearly. Merivale sat down next to him, on her haunches, in her light-colored dress, on the dirty ground. She looked at the drawing. She asked another question, then another, then one more. Half an hour later, Dan was explaining to her the principle of transmitting rotation through gears, a cat's tooth. Ella approached. She saw them. She saw the dress. She saw the face. She recognized her. Caldwell. Ella froze. Merivale looked up. Their eyes met. Silence. Dan didn't know who was standing before him. Ella knew. She said quietly and evenly that this was the Baron's niece. Dan looked at Merivale. Merivale stood up, mud on the hem of her dress, mud on her knees. She said yes. She was Merivale Caldwell, and that she was leaving already. She turned and walked toward the road. Dan watched her go. Then he looked at the drawing on the ground, then at Ella. Ella said he was an idiot. Dan asked why. She said he'd just spent half an hour explaining to the Baron's spy how all his mechanisms worked. Dan was silent. Then he said she wasn't a spy. Ella asked how he knew. Dan said spies don't ask why 2 degrees and not 3. Spies ask how much things cost and who else knows. Ella was silent. Then she said he was an idiot anyway, but her voice was softer. Merivale went home. Dan thought about her one evening. Then he stopped. There were more important things to do. 3 days later, she came back, without warning, in a different dress, also clean, also embroidered. She brought a notebook and a pen. She asked if she could draw the mechanisms for her uncle's report. Dan said, "Draw." She drew, badly. The lines were crooked. The proportions were wrong. She got angry. She erased it. She drew it again, crooked again. Ji-young came over. She looked at her drawing, then at the mill, then at the drawing. Then she took the pen from Merivale's hands, and in a minute, she drew the mill. Exactly. Down to the tiniest detail, every tooth of every gear, every bracket, every bucket. Merivale looked at the drawing, then at Ji-young, then at the drawing. She opened then and closed it. Ji-young returned the pen to her and went back to the mill. Merivale sat there with the perfect drawing in her notebook, and for the first time ever, her face was completely open, confused, alive. She came back 4 more times over the next 2 weeks, every time with questions, every time Dan answered. One occasion she asked if she could help, not with drawing, help with her hands. Dan gave her a rag and told her to wipe the dirt off the bearings. She wiped for 2 hours. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were covered in oil. Her hair was a mess. When she left, Merivale answered Ella's question about why she was doing this by saying she didn't know. Ella told Dan that she was starting to like the Baron's niece, but she didn't trust her. Dan said that liking someone and trusting them were 2 different things. Ella looked at him and said he sounded like an old man. Dan said he felt like an old man. 2 lives in 27 years. Ella didn't understand. He didn't explain. Merivale, the report to the Baron. Dan knew she would write it. The question was what exactly she would write. The truth or not? He didn't ask. It was her choice, not his. The following week, he found out the answer. Pratt didn't come back. The Baron was silent. That meant either Merivale had written what the Baron wanted to hear or something that made him think. Dan didn't know exactly what, but silence was better than a visit from men with clubs. For now. The rye was filling out. The ears were getting heavy. Harvest in 3 weeks. Dan began to prepare. He needed sickles, hands, a place to dry the grain, a place to thresh. He had 1 sickle, dull, rusty. He'd found it in a ditch behind the barn. Fergus sharpened it and forged 2 more. In exchange, Dan sketched him a design for pedal-powered bellows. Fergus could blow the bellows and forge at the same time, with both hands. Without an apprentice to turn the bellows, his son could finally learn to forge instead of pumping air. Fergus looked at the sketch and said 3 sickles. Dan said he'd asked for 2. Fergus said 3, and turned back to the anvil. It was his way of saying thank you. Ella was sharpening the sickles on a stone, with long, even strokes. The sound of metal on stone was thin and sharp, like the sickle itself. Ji-young practiced reaping. Dan showed her. The left hand grabs a bundle of stalks. The right cuts with the sickle at the base. A quick motion away from you, not toward you, away from you. She got it right the first time. Perfect. Faster than he could do it himself. Motor memory. Dan shook his head. See it once and repeat it better than the teacher. An unfair advantage. 3 weeks until harvest. 2, 1. The rye stood golden, the ears bent toward the ground under the weight of the grain. Dan walked across the field. He plucked an ear, crushed it in his palm. The grains rolled out, large, full, firm. He popped one into his mouth, bit down. It crunched, mealy, ripe. The system confirmed, ready for harvest, 94%. Optimal window, 3 days. Dan gathered the men. Ella, Ji-young, Tom, Alden, Alden's brother. Fergus came on his own, uninvited. Like a wheel turning. With his son. 7 reapers, half a hectare, 3 days. The first day of the harvest began at dawn. Dan led the way, sickle in his right hand, grasping a sheaf of rye with his left. Cutting, laying the sheaf on the ground. Step, grasping, cutting, laying, rhythm, fast, steady. Ella followed him at the same rhythm. Ji-young was slightly faster than both of them. Her sickle flashed as if alive. Tom and Alden were slower, but steady. Fergus cut the rye as if he were cutting iron, with powerful strokes, not pretty, but effective. His son gathered the sheaves and laid them out in rows to dry. By noon on the first day, 1/5 of the field had been harvested. By evening, 1/3. Dan stood among the stubble and looked at the rows of sheaves. Golden, even, heavy with grain. His back ached, his hands burned, his knees were shaking. But the sheaves were there, and there were many of them. On the second day, 2 more arrived. Alden's neighbors, uninvited. They just showed up with sickles. Dan nodded at them. They lined up. They reaped. 9 reapers. By evening of the second day, 2/3 of the field was clear. On the third day, they finished. Half a hectare of rye reaped and stacked in sheaves. Dan stood at the edge of the empty field. Stubble jutted from the ground in short, stiff columns. The sheaves were drying in rows. The sun was setting. He was so tired he couldn't feel his body. Threshing began the following. Dan could have threshed by hand, with flails, like everyone did in Hopefield. But that would have taken a week per sack. He didn't have a week per sack. He needed 20 sacks in 10 days, because the harvest was due in 3 weeks. The system offered a solution, a mechanical thresher. Simple. A wooden drum with wooden teeth packed around its circumference. The drum spins. The teeth beat against the sheaves. The grain flies out. The straw remains, powered by a water wheel, via a belt drive, a leather belt from the axle to the drum. Dan built the thresher in 3 days. Ella carved the drum out of a thick log. Ji-young carved the teeth. Dan assembled the frame and the drive. He connected it to the first wheel, which was now free from irrigation duties. The field is harvested. There's nothing left to irrigate. The wheel can be used for threshing. Startup. The wheel spins. The belt tightens. The drum begins to rotate. The tines flash by. Dan feeds in the first sheaf. The tines catch the stalks. They tear. They strike. Grain flies in all directions. Too hard. The grain flies out of the chute. Dan stopped the wheel. He thought. He needs a cover, a wooden box around the drum, so the grain doesn't scatter but falls down into the collection chute. Another half day on the cover. Second start. A sheaf into the drum. The tines tear. Grain flies into the sides of the cover. It bounces off. It falls into the trough. Straw comes out the other side, clean, without grain. It works. Dan fed in the sheaves, one after another. Ji-young gathered the grain from the chute into sacks. Ella brought the sheaves. Tom came to help. Alden, too. On the first day, they threshed 1/4 of the harvest, 5 sacks of grain. Dan weighed one in his hands. 30 kilograms, full, heavy. 5 sacks a day. By hand, it would have taken a week. 20 sacks in 4 days, even with a margin. The system chimed. Agricultural engineering skill, 71% to rank C. Dan worked, day after day, threshing, bags, grain. On the 3rd day of threshing, Becca Turner came to the farm. Dan had seen her before, once, at the market. A large, red-headed woman with a scar on her eyebrow. Ella said she'd been kicked off the Barnes farm after she hit the foreman, for a reason. The foreman had made a move on her younger sister, 14 years old. Becca broke his nose and 2 fingers. She was fired that same day. Her sister was transferred to another farm.
Becca lived in the woods, somewhere, somehow. She stood at the edge of the yard, big, heavy, hands like a man's. Her face was hidden. She looked at the thresher, at the people, at Dan. Then she walked over. She spoke briefly. "Feed me, I work. Don't feed me, I'm leaving. I'm not afraid of Baron. He owes me my teeth." Dan looked at her. Then he said he'd feed her. She nodded.
Took off her jacket, walked over to the pile of sheaves, and began feeding them into the thresher, faster than anyone before her, with powerful, steady movements, sheaf after sheaf, without stopping. In half a day, with Becca, they threshed as much as they had in a whole day without her. By the evening of the fourth day, all the sheaves had been threshed. 22 sacks of grain. Dan counted them. 22. 2 more than the system's forecast. That meant the harvest was higher than expected. That meant the top dressing with fermented grass had worked better than expected. That meant there was enough water. That meant everything he'd done for 2.5 months had been worth it. 22 sacks. Now they had to be ground. The mill was running. The second wheel was turning. The millstones hummed. Dan loaded the first sack. The grain poured into the hopper. The millstones started turning. The flour began to flow. Grinding 1 sack took 4 hours. 22 sacks meant 88 hours. 9 days if he ground for 10 hours a day. Ready in 2.5 weeks. That would be enough. Dan ground, day and night. He slept 4 hours at a time. Ella took over for him. She kept an eye on the mill. She added grain. She removed the flour. Ji-young cleaned the millstones of the stuck-on porridge twice a day. Otherwise, the grain would clog up and the flour would come out coarse. Becca carried the sacks from the barn to the mill, from the mill to the barn. Heavy, 30 kilograms each, like feathers to her. On the 5th day of grinding, Becca sat down next to Dan by the mill, silently. Then she asked if he had a job for her sister. Dan asked what her sister could do. Becca said nothing. She's 14. She knows how to be afraid. Dan was silent. Then he asked if her sister had hands. Becca looked at him strangely. She said she did. 2. Dan said that then she could weave. Becca said they didn't have a loom. Dan said they would. Becca looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up and went to chop wood. 4 hours straight. Dan heard the axe striking the logs, steadily, heavily. It was her way of coping with something. Maybe with gratitude, maybe with hope. She didn't know how to do either. The chopping went on, day after day, sack after sack. The flour lay white in the chest Ella had nailed together from planks, dry, clean, with a lid. 16 sacks of flour by the 10th day. From 22 sacks of grain, they got 16 sacks of flour and 6 sacks of bran. Bran cost money too. Not much, but it cost something. 16 sacks of flour at 1.5 gold pieces each is 24, minus 4 for expenses and seeds, 20, plus the bran, 21. 18 in debt. 3 gold pieces over budget. Dan stood in front of a row of flour sacks and counted. 3 gold pieces over budget. Not 4, as he'd dreamed, but 3. Enough. More than enough. The system chimed. Agricultural engineering skill, rank C. Progress, 0% to rank B. New modules, windmill, silage tower, horse-drawn cedar. Simple greenhouses with double glazing made of mica. Dan looked at the panel. Rank C. From barren land to rank C in 3 months. Not through combat, not through magic. Through water. Through grain. Through flour. Through people. He closed the panel. Tax due in 5 days. But on the night of the 4th day before the tax was due, the Baron's men arrived. Dan woke up to a smell. Smoke.
not from the hearth. Sharp, pungent, burning resin. He jumped up, peered out of the barn. 3 figures in the yard, with torches. One was already swinging to throw a torch onto the barn roof. Dan yanked the rope. That very one. The valve on the pipe from the upper pond opened. Water gushed from the end of the pipe onto the barn roof, not down, to the side, into the yard. The jet hit the first man in the chest. He flew back 2 steps. The torch went out in the puddle. The second man turned around. The jet knocked him off his feet. The third dropped his torch and ran. The torch fell into the puddle. It hissed. It went out. The yard was flooding with water. Dan stood in the barn doorway, holding the rope. Water was pouring out. 2 men on the ground, wet, dazed. One tried to stand. He slipped. He fell. Becca burst out from behind the barn, with an axe, wearing only a shirt. She stood between the wet men and Dan, axe on her shoulder, her face stony. The Baron's men saw the axe. They saw Becca. They saw her face. They got up and ran, fast, without looking back. Becca stood with the axe and watched them go. Then she turned to Dan, looked at the pipe from which water was still dripping, at the puddle in the yard, at the extinguished torches. Then she said she'd changed her mind. She wouldn't leave,
even if he stopped feeding her. Dan closed the damper, the water flowing. He stood barefoot in the puddle, in the silence of the night. Dan spent the 4 days before the tax deadline preparing. He didn't just need to pay, he needed to show the difference between what was 3 months ago and what is now, between an empty farm and sacks of flour, between dead earth and a wheel that turns. Not to show the Baron already knew, to show the village, so that when he laid the sacks at the collector's feet, people would stand behind him, not because he asked, but because they would want to themselves. Ella said he didn't need to show anything. The village sees every day, water in the barrel, greens in the fields, flour from the mill. Dan said that seeing and standing alongside are 2 different things. Ella paused and said he was right. Dan didn't campaign, didn't go from yard to yard, didn't force anyone. He just worked, just as he had worked for all 3 months. He cleaned the channels, he greased the bearings, he checked the gutters, he ground grain for those who brought it. Ji-young sat by the mill and planed spare parts. Becca chopped wood and watched the road. Ella helped with the flour. Tom Hazel came on the 2nd day and asked if they needed help with the harvest. Dan said no. Tom said he'd come anyway. Alden came on the 3rd day. He said the same thing. Fergus didn't come and didn't say anything, but his son ran over and said his father would be in the square, with a hammer, just in case. Dan smiled. A blacksmith's hammer is a serious argument. The evening before the harvest, Dan was sitting in the barn. 6 sacks of the best flour stood in a row against the wall. Selected, sifted, clean, each tied with a new rope. The weight was written on each corner. 30 kilograms, 6 sacks of 30 each. 180 kilograms of flour. At 1.5 gold pieces per sack, that's 9 gold pieces, plus another 10 sacks that he'd sell to the merchant from town at the usual price, plus the bran. Total, more than 20. 18 on credit, 2 to repay the communal grain to Harold, with interest, as promised. The rest for seeds for next season. Dan counted and recounted. It all added up. But somewhere inside, something was tightening. Not fear. Something else. Anticipation. He'd been heading toward this day for 3 months. From that first morning when he woke up face down in the dead earth. From the dull knife. From the empty well. From the system panel that displayed the ditch's blueprint. Every day, every swing of the axe, every groove of the chisel, every stone for the bearing, every blade for the wheel, every furrow in the field, every grain. All for tomorrow. He lay down on the bench, didn't sleep,
listened. The wheel creaked by the stream. Water splashed in the buckets. The mill hummed. Night sounds that had become familiar. Familiar. His sounds. Morning. Tax day. Dan got up before dawn. He washed his face, put on a clean shirt. Ella had brought it yesterday. She said he couldn't go to pay taxes in dirty clothes. He didn't argue. He went out into the yard. The sacks were standing by the barn, 6 of them, a cart nearby. Tom had brought his, an old one, creaky, but the wheels held up. Dan loaded the sacks, 6 of them, 180 kilograms. The cart sagged but held up. He grabbed the shafts and set off. Along the path from the farm to the village, the sun was rising behind him. A long shadow stretched out ahead.
The shadow of a man with a cart. After 200 steps, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around. Ella, with a hoe on her shoulder. He didn't ask why she had a hoe on the way. She didn't explain either. Another 100 steps, and there was Ji-young. She was running. She was late. Wood chips in her hair, as usual. Another 50 steps, and there was Becca, with an axe. Silent. The 4 of them walked together. Then 5. Tom came out of his yard with his wife. His wife was coughing but kept walking. Tom was carrying a boy in his arms. Eve had of Gordon Day with his brother. Fergus with his son, with a hammer on his shoulder. Old woman Elsa, with a bucket in her hands. The bucket was full. Water from the barrel in the square. From his barrel. She wasn't carrying it to drink. She was carrying it as a sign. Proof. Dan didn't ask any of them to come. They came on their own, one after another, yard after yard. By the time Dan had dragged the cart to the square, half of Hopefield was following him. In silence, without banners, without shouts, just people following a man carrying flour. The tax collector was already standing in the square, at a table with scales and an account book. 2 soldiers stood nearby, royal ones, not the barons, the state's tax. And standing there was Baron Oswald Caldwell, in a dark doublet, with a silver chain across his chest, hands behind his back. Next to him, Pratt with a notebook. Behind them, 4 of the baron's men, burly, with clubs on their belts. The baron looked at Dan. Dan looked at the baron. Face to face for the first time. The baron was older than Dan had expected. 55, maybe 60. A heavy face, tired. Deep wrinkles around his mouth, dark eyes. Not angry. Heavy. It was the face of a man who had been carrying something for many years and was tired of it, but couldn't let go. Dan rolled the cart up to the collector's table. He took off the first sack, placed it on the scales. The collector looked at it. He wrote down the weight. He opened the sack. He reached in. He pulled out a handful of flour. He rubbed it between his fingers. He sniffed it. He looked at Dan. He said it was top-grade flour. Dan nodded. He took down the second sack, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. The collector weighed each one, recorded it, checked it, handful by handful. The square was silent. People stood in a semicircle behind Dan. The baron stood opposite. Between them was a table with scales and sacks of flour. The collector finished. He looked up. He glanced at the book, then at Dan, and said, "Old Mercer Farm. Debt, 18 gold pieces. 6 sacks of first-grade flour delivered. Total weight, 180 kilograms. At the market price of 1.5 gold pieces per 30 kilograms, total, 9 gold. Dan pulled a leather pouch from his belt. He placed it on the table. The collector opened it. He counted the coins. 9 gold coins. Coins from the sale of the remaining sacks to the merchant last night. The collector made a note. He looked up. And for the first time all day, something changed on his face. He said, "Old Mercer Farm. Debt paid in full.
4 sacks of flour over the quota. Recorded. Seal. He stamped the book. Red, round, heavy. Next to the name Mercer. Not a debt, not arrest, not confiscation. Paid off. Above quota. The Baron stood motionless. His face didn't change. Not a single muscle. He looked at Dan. Dan looked at him. Silence. Then someone in the crowd laughed, quietly. Through her tears, old woman Elsa.
She stood with a bucket of water and laughed, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Just like that day when she first saw water flowing from a wooden pipe. Only now she was laughing. Harold stood next to her, arms crossed, upright, calm, with an expression on his face that said, I knew my wife wasn't wrong. Tom held the boy in his arms. The boy didn't understand what was happening. Tom did. Alden nodded, slowly, like a man who had bet on the right horse and it had come in first. Fergus stood with a hammer and a face of stone. But his son beside him was grinning from ear to ear. Ella stood slightly behind Dan. He couldn't see her face, but he could hear her breathing, even, deep, the way people breathe when they're holding back something big. Ji-Yong stood next to Ella, quiet, small, with splinters in her hair. She didn't fully understand what a bid was or why everyone was so excited, but she saw the faces, and that was enough. Becca stood with an axe on her shoulder and looked at the Baron's men, calmly, appraisingly, like someone who knows there won't be a fight today but is ready if there has to be one. The Baron turned to Pratt, said something quietly. Pratt wrote it down. Then the Baron looked at Dan again and spoke. One sentence. He said that Dan didn't understand what they were going to do to him. Dan asked who they were. The Baron didn't answer. He turned around and walked away. His men followed him. Pratt brought up the rear, writing as he went. They walked down the road toward the castle. The square watched them go. Then Harold turned to Dan. He approached. He didn't extend his hand. He did something else. He took off his hat, pressed it to his chest, and he spoke to the entire square, breaking the silence. Young man, you are no longer a stranger to us. You are one of us. The square was silent for a second. Then Elsa began to cry even louder, and someone clapped. Winter came 3 weeks after the harvest. The first frost struck at night, and by morning the puddles in the yard were covered with a thin sheet of ice. Dan stepped out of the barn and saw his breath hang in the air like a white cloud. The water wheel by the stream turned more slowly. The water was thickening from the cold. It hadn't frozen yet, but it would soon. He needed to prepare. Winter in Hopefield meant hunger. Every year. For the last 10 years. Supplies ran out by February. People ate bark and frozen turnips from the cellars. Children fell ill. The elderly died. It was the norm, a familiar, quiet death that no one flinched at anymore. Dan was going to change that. The system had unlocked 2 key modules for him at Rank B, a grain and vegetable dryer and a greenhouse with double-glazed mica windows. The dryer allowed him to preserve the harvest for months. The greenhouse allowed him to grow crops in winter. 2 tools against starvation. Dan started with the dryer. A simple design, a wooden box 3 meters long. Inside, shelves made of thin slats with gaps. A firebox beneath the box. No open flame, a closed channel. Hot air from the coals travels through a stone channel under the box floor. It rises upward through the slats. It passes through the shelves with sliced vegetables or scattered grain. It dries them. It exits through a pipe at the top. The temperature is controlled by a damper on the firebox. More air means it's hotter. Less air means it's cooler. The system has shown the optimal setting. 45 degrees for vegetables, 60 for grain. Any higher is out of the question.
It'll burn. Any lower is pointless.
It won't dry. Dan spent a week building the dryer. Ella helped with the wood. Ji-young cut the slats for the shells. Identical, as always. Becca hauled stones for the channel. Heavy, flat, river stones. She stacked them the way walls are stacked, even, tight. No mortar, just stone upon stone. It turned out that Becca knew how to lay stonework. She'd learned from the stonemason at the Barnes farm, the very same manager whose nose she'd broken, before she broke it. The dryer worked on the first try. Dan loaded the first batch, sliced turnips, thin slices. He laid them out on the slats. But he sawed. The hot air started flowing. 6 hours later, the turnips had turned into light, crispy slices, dry, hard, almost weightless. Dan tried one, slightly sweet, crunchy. If you pour boiling water over it, it's soft again in 10 minutes, almost like fresh. Ella tried one, then another. Then she said it could be stored until spring. Dan said it could be stored until next fall. She looked at him, then at the dryer, then at him again, and said he needed to build a second one. He said he would, but first, a greenhouse. The greenhouse was more complicated. He needed mica, A transparent mineral that splits into thin sheets. It lets light through. It retains heat. The glass of this world. Only glass was expensive and fragile, while mica was cheap and flexible. The problem: where to get mica? Ella said there were mica deposits in the hills to the east. Miners from the city sometimes went there. But for the villagers, it's far, a 2-day journey. Dan thought. 2 days there, 2 back. A day for mining, 5 days. He couldn't be gone for 5 days. Too much to do. The mill, the canals, the drying shed, winter preparations. And then Sona Park arrived. She came in the 3rd week of winter, on horseback, in traveling leather. Tall, dark hair tied in a bun, a rosary on her belt. Behind her, a wagon train of 3 carts. She dismounted at Hopefield Square. She looked around. She saw a water barrel, a trough. She heard the hum of the mill beyond the village. She asked the first person she met where the guy was who grew grain in a drought. They showed her. She arrived at Dan's farm. She stood at the gate and looked around. A wheel, a mill, a dryer with smoke coming out of it. A green field. No, once green. Now stubble under a frost. But you can tell something grew here. Recently, a lot. She walked into the yard. Dan came out of the barn. They looked at each other. She introduced herself. Sona Park, grain merchant, caravan owner. She'd heard that in Hopefield, the village was selling flour during the drought. She'd come to check it out. Dan said there were 4 sacks of flour for sale right now. She asked the price. He said 1.5 gold pieces. She said 1. He said 1.5. She said 1 and 2. He said 1.5. She looked at him, then at the mill, then at the sacks in the barn. Then she laughed, briefly, sharply, and said 1.5. But she wants a contract for next season. 10 sacks of flour at 1.5 gold pieces each. 15 gold pieces. 5 gold pieces up front now, the rest upon delivery in the fall. Dan did the math in his head. 5 gold pieces up front. That's seeds, tools, mica for the greenhouse, maybe even a horse. No, too soon. But 5 gold pieces is air. Freedom. The chance to build not by scraping by, but by planning. He said yes. They shook hands. Sonia's hand was stiff and dry, a merchant's grip. She stayed for a day, walked around the village, looked, Counted, talked with Harold, with Fergus, with Tom. In the evening, she came to Dan again. The village gathered around the fire. Ella was there. Ji-young was there. Becca was chopping wood a short distance away. Sonia sat silently, staring at the fire. Then she told her story. 3 years ago, she was leading a grain convoy, north, to a village that was starving after a crop failure. A 2-day journey. The Baron's soldiers from the neighboring province intercepted the convoy at the border. They took everything. The grain went to army warehouses. The village received nothing. A month later, the village was gone. 43 people, women, children, old people. They died, not from war, not from disease, because the grain never arrived. Sonia fell silent. The fire crackled. Then she said that ever since then she's been looking for a way to make it so that grain wouldn't need to be transported, so that it would grow where people are, everywhere, regardless of drought, regardless of the barrens. She looked at Dan, at his mill, at his canals, at his wheels, and said he was the first person in 3 years who had given her hope that it was possible. Dan was silent. Then he said it was possible, but not quickly. She said she wasn't in a hurry. Then she took a bundle out of her saddlebag, unwrapped it. Mica, 20 sheets, each the size of a palm, thin, transparent. She said she'd been carrying them for someone else, but Dan needed them more. Consider it part of an advance. Dan took a sheet of mica, held it up to the fire. Light shone right through it. Warm, golden. He looked at Sana through the mica. Her face blurred in the amber glow. She smiled and said he looked as if he were seeing not just the mica, but the whole world. Dan said he saw a greenhouse. She didn't understand. He'd explain later. Sana left the next morning, with 4 sacks of flour, with a contract for 15 gold pieces, with 5 gold pieces as an advance that she left for Dan, and with a promise to return in the spring. Dan stood at the gate and watched her wagon drive away down the winter road. Then he turned toward the barn. The mica lay on the bench, 20 sheets. He began to build the greenhouse. A wooden frame, 2 meters by 4. A sloped roof facing south, double walls, air between the walls. The inner wall was lined with mica, the outer one too. The air gap between them acts as insulation. Light passes through. Heat stays inside. Inside, there is an earthen floor, raised, with a channel for warm water. Water from the stream flowed through a slow channel next to the dryer's furnace. It heated up. It ran under the greenhouse floor. It gave off heat to the earth. It flowed back into the stream. A closed loop. Not hot, warm. Enough so that the soil inside the greenhouse wouldn't freeze even when it was -10 outside. It took 2 weeks to build the greenhouse. The whole team worked on it. Ella made the frame. Jiyun cut the frames for the mica. Becca dug the channel. Dan designed and assembled it. The first frosts hit when the greenhouse was 3/4 ready. Dan was in a hurry. He cut the mica. He fitted the frames. He sealed the joints with oiled cloth. He finished it at night, by candlelight. In the morning, he went inside. It was -8 outside. Inside, it was +5. Dan stood in the greenhouse and felt the warmth. Warmth from the water under the floor. Warmth from the sun through the mica. Warmth from the earth. He planted the first seedlings that same day. Lettuce, onions, turnips, early varieties that don't need much light. A week later, the greens sprouted. Green, bright, in January, when it's white and dead outside. Ella walked into the greenhouse. She stopped. She touched an onion sprout, green, alive, in January. She said 2 words. It's impossible. Dan said it was possible. She stood there for another minute. Then she went out. An hour later, she returned with Harold. Harold went inside. He looked at the sprouts, at the mica through which the white winter light streamed, at the damp, warm soil. He touched the wall. Warm. Then he went out, stood in the cold, breathed in the icy air, looked at the greenhouse from the outside. Small, wooden, with mica windows through which greenery was visible. Greenery in January.
Spring came with the rains, real rain for the first time in 4 years. No drought, water from the sky. The stream swelled, the wheels turned faster, the canals overflowed. Dan spent 2 days reworking the drainage system so the excess water would flow back into the stream instead of flooding the fields. The system showed him an overflow valve, a simple design.
When the water level in the canal rises above a certain point, it flows out through a side drain. Automatically, without human intervention. 3 valves on the main canal solved the problem. Dan stood in the rain and watched as the water flowed in the right direction. Wet, dirty, satisfied. Spring meant a new season, a new planting, a new harvest. But Dan wasn't thinking only about grain. He was thinking about the school. The system had unlocked a B-rank module, a school, not a building, an idea. A way to pass on knowledge so that it didn't depend on a single person, on him. If Dan died tomorrow, everything he had built would last until it broke. And then it would die with him. Because no one knows how to fix it. Except Ella. Except Ji-young. But Ella knows with her hands, not her head. She can repeat. She can't come up with anything new. Ji-young can copy any mechanism, but she can't calculate the load. She can't design something she hasn't seen. They needed theory, principles, understanding why, not just how. Dan chose the spot. An old barn on the edge of the farm, crooked, abandoned. He and Becca straightened it out in 2 days. Ella put on a new roof. Ji-young knocked together some benches from scraps. 3 benches. A board on the wall for drawing. Chalk. Lots of chalk. Ella found a chalk deposit in a ravine behind the village. White, soft, easy to draw with on dark wood. The first lesson. 3 students. Ella, Ji-young, and Martin, Fergus's son. 14 years old. Quiet, attentive. His hands are already heavy from the hammer, but his eyes are lively. Fergus brought him himself, said the boy needs to know more than his father. It was the longest sentence Dan had ever heard from Fergus. First lesson, the lever. Dan drew a stick on a rock on the board, a weight on one end, a hand on the other. He explained. The long end moves far, but with little force. The short end moves little, but with great force, exchanging distance for force. That is a lever. Everything else is a variation. Ella listened. She nodded. She knew this intuitively, her whole life. Now that knowledge had a name. Ji-young listened and drew. Not letters, diagrams. Her notebook was full of arrows and circles and lines. A letterless summary. Martin listened and didn't understand. Then Dan told him to imagine lifting a hammer. With a short handle, it's hard. With a long one, it's easier. Why? Because a long handle is a long lever. You move your arm farther, but you need less force. Martin blinked. Then his eyes lit up. He said, that's why his father's hammer with the long handle hits easier than his own hammer with the short one. Dan said, exactly. Martin smiled. For the first time in class. Classes were held every morning, an hour, sometimes 2. Dan explained. Lever, wheel, axle, inclined plane, wedge, screw. 6 simple mechanisms that make up everything. Every mill, every pump, every wheel. Combinations of 6 things. He drew on the board, sketched, erased, sketched again. Ella asked questions, practical ones. How thick should the axle be for a wheel with a 3-meter diameter? Dan explained how to calculate it. Load, torque, wood strength. Formulas that he translated into plain language. If the axle has to support 100 kilograms at a distance of 1 meter from the support, then the thickness must be at least 15 centimeters for oak, because oak can withstand that much. Ella took notes, in letters. She knew how to write. Ji-young drew diagrams, the same information, in 2 formats, for 2 different minds. Dan looked at them and thought that this was what school was. Not a building, not a curriculum. 3 people learning to think. After 2 weeks of classes, Martin came to Dan one evening with a piece of paper. There was a drawing on it, crooked, hesitant, but recognizable. A foot-powered hammer, the one Dan had built for Fergus. Martin had drawn it from memory, with mistakes. The lever was too short, the counterweight was too far away, but the idea was right. He said he wanted to build a second one, for the forge, a small one, for small jobs, a pedal-operated jeweler's hammer. Dan looked at the drawing, corrected the proportions, explained why. Martin listened, nodded, took the drawing. A week later, he brought a working mechanism, small, elegant, a pedal-operated hammer for delicate work. Fergus stood nearby and watched. His face was like stone. But when Martin pressed the pedal and the hammer gently struck the thin wire, bending it into a perfect loop, Fergus placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Heavy, warm. He said nothing, but Martin looked up, and his face said it all. Alongside school, Dan was preparing for the spring planting, on a larger scale than last year, 1.5 hectares instead of half. The contract with Sonia required 10 bags of flour, but Dan wanted more, 20, 30, enough for the whole village, for sale, for stock, for the next advance to expand. For 1.5 hectares, he needed 3 times as much water. 2 wheels weren't enough. Dan designed a third, bigger than the previous ones, 3 meters in diameter, with 30 buckets with an iron axle. Yes, iron. Fergus forged it, long, thick, sturdy. In exchange for a blueprint for a foot-powered lathe, Fergus could now turn on the lathe instead of using a file. His eyes when he saw the first smooth blank come off the lathe were just like Elsa's when she saw green onions in February. The third wheel was set lower down the stream by early spring. 3 wheels, 1 for irrigation, 1 for the mill, 1 for threshing and storage. 12 of the 40 yards now got water from Dan's system. 10 more were asking for it. Dan couldn't connect them all. The stream wasn't endless. Water was limited. He needed a second source. The system gave him an idea. A well, a deep one, with a water-lifting wheel inside, buckets on an endless chain. The wheel at the top turns by wind or water power. The buckets go down, scoop up water, come back up, pour into the reservoir. Non-stop. Dan looked at his empty well, the very same one, the one he'd thrown a pebble into on the first day. A thud. No splash. Dry. But that was 3 months ago. Maybe the water level had risen after the rains. He threw the pebble again, once, twice. A splash. Water. Not deep, about 6 meters. Dan smiled. The well had come back to life. The rain had filled the aquifer. The water had returned. All that was left was to draw it up. But that was a task for the summer. For now, the stream was enough. For now, it was time to sow. Merivale arrived, for the first time since fall. She had changed, not the dress was different, simpler, darker, more practical. Her face had changed. Something in her eyes, not aloofness, determination. She came alone, without guards, without a notebook. She sat down on a bench by the school barn. Dan came out. He looked at her. She said she'd left her uncle. Dan said nothing. She continued. She said the Baron was marrying her off to the son of a count from a neighboring province. A deal. Land in exchange for connections. She knew it would come to this. She'd known it her whole life. But after she'd come here 5 times and watched the gears turn and the water rise and the flour flow from under the millstone, after Dan spent half an hour explaining to her why 2 degrees and not 3, after that, she realized she couldn't do it. Not because the groom was a bad man. She didn't know him. Because she wants to understand how the world works. And the Count's wife,
has no right to want such things. Dan listened. Then he asked where she would live. She said she didn't know. She had nothing, no home, no money, no name. Caldwell was no longer her surname. The Baron had disowned her. Dan looked at her, then at the barn school, then at the benches inside. 3 benches. A 4th wouldn't hurt. He said he had a job for her, if she was ready to learn and to teach. Miravet asked what to teach. Dan said to translate his language into the language of people, technical terms into understandable language. She'd done that before. When she asked why 2 degrees, every question she asked was a translation from the language of an engineer into the language of a human. He needed a translator like that, for the school,
For the village, for those who would come later. Miravet looked at him. Then, for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she smiled. She didn't twitch the corner of her mouth. She didn't hide it. She smiled, openly, and said it was the best offer she'd ever received in her 22 years of life. 4 students in the school: Ella, Ji-young, Martin, Miravet, and Dan, who taught. Every morning, an hour. A lever, a wheel, a gear, a cam, water pressure, load calculation. Miravet listened and took notes. Then she rewrote it in her own words, simpler, clearer. For those who aren't Dan, for those who aren't engineers, for ordinary people. She translated the lever through a quarrel with her mother-in-law that Dan had once used and added her own metaphors. Water pressure is like a crowd at the entrance to a fair. The narrower the door, the harder they push. The villagers nodded. They understood. Dan listened to her explanations and thought she was doing it better than he was. Much better. Because she thinks like them. And he thinks like an engineer. She needed a bridge. She was that bridge. After a month of lessons, people from the village began dropping by the school. Not to sign up, just to listen. They stood by the door, sat on the floor, listened as Ma Rivy explained why the mill turns. Then they left. The summer of the 2nd year brought changes Dan hadn't expected. The first, an envoy from the crown, a man in plain clothes, no coat of arms, no guards. He came on foot. He called himself Leonard Faust, an official, 3rd rank, Department of Agriculture of the Kingdom of Vale Green. He came to the mill. He stood and watched. For a long time. Then he approached Dan, said he'd been sent to investigate. Word had reached the capital that in Baron Caldwin's province there was a village that hadn't gone hungry last winter. The only one in the entire barony. The only one in the province. Possibly the only one in the kingdom. He'd been sent to find out why. Dan showed him. Wheels, canals, a mill, drying sheds, 2 now. Greenhouses, 2. A school, a threshing machine. Faust walked around, looked, touched, took notes, silently. His face showed nothing. A bureaucrat, a professional mask. But his hands trembled as he took notes. Dan noticed. That evening, Faust sat with Dan by the fire, without his entourage, alone. He said the crown had a problem. War with the Southern Duchy, undeclared but real. Armies are stationed at the border. There's nothing to feed them. 3 years of drought had destroyed the harvest throughout the kingdom. The royal granaries were empty. If the Southern Duke found out just how empty they were, he would cross the border tomorrow. Faust asked if Dan could do what he had done with Hopefield to the other villages. With 10, with 50, with the whole province. Dan was silent for a long time. Then he said he could, but not alone. He needed apprentices, lots of them. Who would go to the villages and build the same systems, canals, wheels, mills, greenhouses, based on his blueprints, under his guidance, but with their own hands. Faust asked how many. Dan said 3 villages to start with, 3 teams of 5 people, 6 months. If it works, then scale it up. Faust said the Crown was ready to fund it. Tools, materials, seeds, wages for the teams. Dan said there was no need for wages. We need people, volunteers, those who want to, not those who are forced. Faust looked at him. Then he nodded, said he'd be back in a month with an answer from the capital, and he left. Dan sat by the fire and thought. 3 villages. That meant he would be leaving Hopefield. For the first time in a year, leaving the farm, the mill, the wheels, the school. To whom? Ella. Ella would manage. She knew every mechanism, every joint, every bearing. Ji-Yong would help with repairs, Martin with the ironwork, Becca with security, Merave with teaching. A team. His team. They would manage. But the thought of leaving scratched at something inside him. He was used to it. To the creak of the wheel, to the hum of the mill, to the smell of flour. To Ella, who comes every evening and sits beside him in silence. To Ji-Yong, who says, "Okay, okay, okay." To Becca, who chops wood when she doesn't know what to say. It had become home. Second change. Hannah Lim, novice of the Order of the Holy Furrow. She appeared a week after Faust, dark hair braided strictly, her habit tied with a rope, a prayer book in her hands. Quiet, composed, her face veiled as befits a nun. She came on a mission. The order wanted to know if the guy with the wheels was a heretic, if he was offending the gods. The harvest is a gift from the earth. The earth gives according to the will of the Holy Furrow. If someone reaps the harvest not through prayer, but through gears, that is heresy. Or perhaps not. The order wasn't sure. That's why they sent Hannah. To check. She stood by the mill and watched, her face inscrutable, the prayer book pressed to her chest. The wheel turned, the millstones hummed, flour flowed. Without prayer, without a blessing, just a mechanism. Dan approached. He asked how he could help. She said she needed to understand how it worked. Dan began to explain. Water, the wheel, gears, stone. She listened. Then she asked where God was in all this. Dan paused. Then he asked if he could ask her a question. She nodded. He asked if she believed that God had given people hands. She said yes. He asked if she believed that God had given people minds. She said yes. He asked if, since God gave people hands and minds, wasn't it an insult not to use either? Hannah was silent for a long time. Then she asked what he meant. Dan said that the wheel wasn't a substitute for God. It was a use of what God had given: water, trees, hands, minds. It doesn't negate God's gift. It applies it. If God created water and gave people a head to think with, then building a wheel isn't heresy. It's gratitude. Hannah looked at him, then at the wheel, then at the prayer book, then at the wheel again. She said nothing. She left. She returned 3 days later. She asked permission to stay for a week. Dan allowed it. She stayed for a month. Every day she walked among the mechanisms. She watched. She wrote in the prayer book, not prayers, observations. Dan didn't peek. A week later, she approached him with a request, a strange one. She said that the village women didn't understand his words. Too complicated. Piston, gear, pressure. Dead words for living people. She offered to translate them in her own way, into the language of faith. A piston is a heart that pushes water. A wheel is a prayer wheel that spins grace. A valve is a mouth that opens and closes at the master's will. Dan listened. Then he said that Merave translates into the language of everyday life, and Hannah can translate into the language of the spirit. 2 translations,
for two types of people. Together they would cover everyone. Hannah nodded. From that day on, she became the school's second translator. Merave spoke as if she were a crowd at the entrance to a fair.
Hannah spoke as if she were the breath of the earth that cannot stop. The same pressure. 2 languages, 2 doors to a single understanding. A month later, Hannah wrote a report to the order. Dan didn't ask what was in it, but the order didn't send a second inquisitor. That was the answer. The third change. The Millers Guild. It didn't come quietly. It came loudly. 3 men on horseback, well-dressed, with the guild's seals on their belts. The eldest introduced himself as Master Hawk, fat, red face, a voice accustomed to shouting. He dismounted in the square and announced that Hopefield Mill was operating illegally, without a guild license, without paying duties, without quality control. He demanded an immediate shutdown. Dan stood by the mill, Ella beside him, Becca a little behind with an axe on her shoulder. Hawk approached. He looked at the mill, at the wheel, at the gears. His face turned even redder. He said it was an illegal structure, that the milling business belonged to the guild, that every millstone in the kingdom had to be consecrated by the guild and operate under the guild's supervision. Dan asked how much the license cost. Hawk said 50 gold pieces a year. Dan looked at him. 50 gold pieces. The farm had cost 30. Hopefield's entire annual harvest wasn't worth 50 gold pieces. It wasn't a license. It was a ban. Dan said he'd think about it. Hawk said he had a week. Then the guild would file a complaint with the royal court, and the mill would be torn down. Hawk left. Dan sat by the mill and thought, 50 gold pieces. Dan left Hopefield at the beginning of the summer of the second year. Ji-young went with him. He didn't take Ella. She had to stay, to run the farm, the mill, the school. Becca stayed with her, and Merave, and Han, and Martin. 5 people. Dan left them the blueprints, everything, on 20 sheets of parchment. Every mechanism, every detail, every dimension, in case something broke. Ella looked at the stack of blueprints, then at Dan. Then she said the blueprints wouldn't replace him. Dan said that was the whole point of the school, so they could replace him. Ella didn't say anything. The journey to the first granary took 4 days. The town of Redmore, 1,000 residents, a market, 2 taverns, the royal granary on the hill. Empty. Cracked walls, a collapsed roof, pigeons and rats inside. Fields nearby, just as dead as Dan's field on the first day. Dry. Cracked. Only the scale was different. Not 1.5 hectares. 30. 30 hectares of dead land. Dan stood on the hill and looked. Ji-young stood beside him. Quiet. Small. With splinters in her hair. Dan said, "Okay." Ji-young said, "Okay, okay, okay." They began. The local village head assigned 10 men, strong men, silent, skeptical. They looked at Dan as if he were crazy. A 27-year-old guy came from the village and said he'd bring water from the river to 30 hectares. No magic, just sticks and ropes. Dan didn't argue. He showed them. He built the first wheel in 3 days. With the help of Ji-young, who carved the parts so quickly that the men stopped chewing and just stood there watching. She worked in silence, quickly, precisely. Every part was a perfect copy of the blueprint. The wheel stood up. The water started flowing. The men fell silent. The same effect. The same moment. Water flowing on its own. No hands, no prayer, nothing. 3 weeks later, there were 2 wheels and a mill standing in Redmore. The canal system covered 5 hectares. The remaining 25 were waiting. But 5 hectares were already turning green. In the middle of a yellow wasteland, a green square, visible from the road. People stopped and watched. Dee left the foreman in charge, a man named Corvin. Quiet, quick to understand. He remembered everything Dan showed him, not like Ji-young, slower, with mistakes. But he remembered. Dan gave him the blueprints, explained the order of expansion, canal by canal, field by field. Corvin nodded. Dan drove on. Second village, third, the same cycle. Wheels, canals, mills. The same faces, distrust, then surprise, then silence by the water that flows on its own. Ji-young worked beside him, quiet, quick, tireless. She had grown over the past year, not in body. She was still small and thin. But inside, she had stopped hiding, stopped lowering her eyes. When the men in the third village said a girl couldn't build a mill, Ji-young silently walked over to the workpiece. She carved a gear in 20 minutes. Perfect. She placed it in front of them and left. The men were silent. Then one picked up the gear, turned it over, looked at the teeth, at the smooth curves, at the precision of each tooth, put it back down, and said nothing more about the girl. Dan returned to Hopefield 3 months later, late summer. He walked along the road to the farm and saw the changes. New channels that he hadn't built, that had been built without him. Ella, Martin, Tom, based on his blueprints. Not perfect. One gutter was crooked, one section was leaking, but they were there. They worked, without him. He reached the farm. Ella was standing by the mill. She saw him. She stopped. She looked. He looked. Then she walked toward him, quickly, almost running. She stopped 2 steps away. She looked. Then she said the bearing on the second wheel had been seizing up for 3 days. She couldn't figure out why. Dan laughed. She didn't get it. Then she did. And for the first time in all the time he'd known her, Ella Whitfield laughed too. Quietly, briefly. But she laughed. Becca was standing by the barn, with an axe, as always. She nodded to Dan. He nodded back. She turned and went to chop wood. Everything was fine. Merave came out of the school barn, with chalk in her hands. 5 students followed her, new ones, from the village. Dan didn't know them. Merave was teaching, by herself, without Dan, using his blueprints and her translations. 5 people were learning to think about mechanisms, without Dan. Hannah was sitting on a bench by the school, with a prayer book. She was reading, or pretending to read. When Dan walked past, she looked up and said she was glad to see him, quietly, calmly, like people who have found peace within themselves say. Dan went into the barn, sat down on a bench. That very one, the first one, the one he'd slept on the first night. The planks still dug into his shoulder blades, but they were his own. He closed his eyes, sat for a minute, then stood up and went to fix the bearing. The bearing stone had worn down. The hole had become too wide. The axle was wobbling. Dan picked out a new stone, fitted it, lubricated it. The wheel ran smoothly. Ella stood nearby and watched. Then she said she knew the stone had worn down. They set out at dawn, Dan and Ella, 2 days to the northeast, through the forest, over the hills, along a trail that hadn't seen human feet in a long time. Ella carried an axe and a bag of food. Dan carried chisels and a rope, and a notebook, empty, for whatever he might find, if he found anything. They walked in silence the first day. The forest was dense and dark. Old trees, thick trunks, moss on the rocks. Streams crossed the path, small, clear. Dan automatically assessed each one. The flow, slope, potential for a wheel, professional habit. Ella walked beside him, steadily, without complaint. A carpenter and a carpenter's daughter, used to the forest, to hard work, to long days. By evening they had set up camp, a campfire, dinner, porridge, and dried turnips. Ella sat across from him and watched the fire. Then she asked why he was going to the ruins. Dan said that the system had shown the coordinates. that there were structures there compatible with his skill, something built a long time ago, a very long time ago. Ella asked what the system was. Dan froze. He had never told anyone. About the panel, about the blueprints in his head, about the ranks, about progress. He always said the knowledge came from his grandfather, that he'd seen it as a child. Ella looked at him through the fire. She waited. Dan thought. Then he decided. She deserved the truth, not all of it, but part of it. He said he sees blueprints in his head. When he thinks about a mechanism, a diagram appears before his eyes, with dimensions, with calculations. He doesn't draw them. They appear on their own. Ella was silent. Then she asked how long it had been. He said from day one, when he woke up in the field. She paused. Then she said that explained a lot. Why he builds so fast, why he makes no mistakes, why every detail is precise. She didn't ask where it came from. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask if it was magic. She just accepted it. The way one accepts that the wind blows and water flows. A fact. Dan looked at her. She was looking at the fire, calm. And he thought that if the whole world were like Ella Whitfield, it would be much simpler. The second day. The hills grew steeper. The trees grew sparser. Rock came to the surface. Gray, old, covered in lichen. By noon, Dan saw the first sign, a rock by the trail, chiseled, smooth edges. Not natural. Man-made. Someone had once worked on this stone, long ago, a very long time ago. The system flashed, approaching the target, 300 meters. They climbed to the crest of the hill and saw it. Below, in the hollow between two hills, lay ruins. Not a castle, not a fortress. A workshop. Huge, stone walls a meter thick, collapsed but recognizable. Inside, the remains of mechanisms. Dan could see them even from above. Rusted iron, rotten wood, stone bases, foundations for heavy structures, large, massive. This was no village mill. This was a factory, an industrial workshop of a caliber this world hadn't seen in 1,000 years. They went down. Dan walked slowly, carefully, every step, every stone, every shard. He read the ruins like a book. Here was the foundation for a water wheel, a massive one, 5 meters in diameter, maybe 6. Next to it, the foundation for the shaft, the transmission, the gears, remnants of teeth on a stone block, machined, precise. Not a cat's tooth, a true involute profile. Someone here knew what Dan knew. I built here for 17 years. Mills, canals, presses. Everything I knew how to build. They came in the 18th year. I don't know who they are. I know they aren't human, or not quite human. They don't want this knowledge to exist. They erased those who came before me. They'll erase me, too. If you're reading this, it means they haven't destroyed everything. Or it means you're new. Run, or build faster than they find out. Dan stood and stared at the wall. The torch trembled in his hand. Ella stood beside him. She couldn't read. She didn't know the letters, but she saw his face. She asked what was written. Dan was silent. Then he translated it, slowly, word by word. The man who built all this came from another world, like Dan. He built it for 17 years. Then someone came and destroyed everything. Ella listened. Then she looked at the wall, at the letters that were just scratches to her. Then at Dan. And she asked one thing. She asked if he was from there too, from another world. Dan looked at her. The torchlight reflected in her eyes, dark, calm, waiting. He said yes. Ella nodded.
The way you nod when the last piece of a mosaic falls into place, without surprise, without fear, just understanding. She said she knew. She didn't know exactly what, but she knew he wasn't like everyone else. From the very first day, from the very first wheel. No one in this world thinks that way. No one builds that way. No one looks at water and sees a car in it. She knew. Dan stood in the basement of the ruins of a 1,000-year-old workshop next to the woman who accepted him just as he was, and felt something big and heavy rising inside him. Something he'd been holding inside for a year. Loneliness. Not external.
Internal. Being the only one who knows, the only one who remembers another world, another life. The wet highway, the truck, the last drawing for Mrs. Hadley. He was no longer the only one who knew. Ella knew. He told her. And she didn't leave. They came out of the basement. The sun was blinding after the darkness. Dan took out his notebook. He began to draw. Everything he saw, every foundation, every mechanism, every tool. Ella helped. She measured with her steps. She counted the stones. They worked until evening. Dan filled 20 pages. Then he sat down on a stone and looked at the ruins. 17 years of work. Destroyed. By someone. By something. The Baron knew. They, those who will come, if they find out. Dan looked at the notebook. 20 pages of drawings, knowledge that someone wanted to erase. Then he looked at Ella. She was sitting nearby, dirty, tired, with an axe on her lap. He thought of Hopefield, of the mill that hums, of the wheels that turn, of the school where Merivale teaches 5 children, of Ji Young, who carves gears with her eyes closed, of Becca with the axe, of Han with the prayer book, about Martin, who built his first mechanism, About Tom, whose field is turning green. About Sonna, whose wagon is carrying flour. About Harold, who took off his hat. About Elsa, who carried a green onion in February like a baby. The previous engineer was alone. He built alone for 17 years. And when they came, he was alone. And they destroyed him. Dan was not alone. He had people who knew, who could carry on, even if he were gone. That was the difference. Not in the mechanisms, not in the gears, not in the ranks. In the people. Knowledge in one head can be destroyed. Knowledge in 20 heads, in 50, in 100. Try destroying that. He stood up, told Ella they were going home. She nodded. They walked back for 2 days, in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the last hill before Hopefield, the sun was setting. The village lay below in golden light, smoke from the chimneys, greenery in the fields, the glint of water in the canals, and 3 wheels, 3 dark circles turning slowly by the stream. The creak of axles, the splash of water, the hum of the mill. Sounds that didn't exist a year ago, that he had created. Ella stopped beside him. She looks down at the village. At the wheels, at the fields. Then she said it was beautiful. Dan said yes. She looked at him. Then she said one more thing. She said that whatever those things were, the ones the previous builder feared and the ones the Baron fears, whatever they were too late. Dan asked why. Ella said, because knowledge is no longer in just one head. It's in the school, in the blueprints, in Ji Young's hands, in Martin's hammer, in Merivale's words, in Hannah's metaphors, in every gutter Tom fixed himself. It can't be erased. Not anymore. Dan looked at her, then at the village below, then at the sky where the first stars were peeking through the golden sunset. The system flickered quietly at the edge of his vision. He didn't open the panel. No need. He knew what was there. Ranks, modules, blueprints, progress. All of that was important.
But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was standing next to him on the hill, with an axe on her shoulder, with calluses on her hands, with eyes reflecting the sunset, and waiting below, in the village where wheels turned and the mill hummed and the air smelled of flour and wet earth after watering. He walked down the hill.
He walked along the path toward the farm. Ella was by his side, step for step. Ji-young was the first to see them. She was sitting on the barn roof, whittling something from a scrap of wood. She saw them on the path. She jumped up. She shouted to the whole village. They were back. Becca came out from behind the barn, with an axe. She looked at Dan, nodded, went to chop wood. Merave ran out of the school, chalk on her fingers, a smile on her face. Hannah looked up from her prayer book, quietly said, "Welcome back." Martin ran out of the smithy, breathing heavily, hands covered in soot. Tom stood by his trough. He waved his hand. Harold stepped out onto the porch, took off his hat, put it back on, his way of saying hello. Elsa stood by the barrel in the square. The barrel was full, as always, for a year now, every day, without a break. Water was flowing, the wheels turned, the mill hummed. And Dan walked along the path to the old Mercer farm, which a year ago had been dead land with a rotten barn and an empty well. And now it was a home. His home. In a world that had tried to erase knowledge and failed. Because knowledge was no longer in just one mind. It was everywhere. In every wheel, in every trough, in every grain, in every handful of flour, in every student, in every drawing on the school wall, in every "okay, okay, okay" spoken by the little girl from the East, not knowing what it meant but feeling that it was right. Dan stepped into the farmyard. A wheel creaked by the stream. The mill hummed behind the barn. He placed the notebook with the drawings of the ruins on a bench in the barn. 20 pages. The knowledge of those who came before him. Now it won't disappear. He stepped out into the yard. He looked at the sunset and thought that tomorrow he needed to draw up a lesson plan for the 2nd grade and fix the 3rd bearing on the big wheel and check out the site for the 4th greenhouse and reply to Sunna about extending the contract and find Micah for the new windows and explain the principle of a worm gear to Martin and draw a diagram of the water press from the ruins for Ji-young and talk to Faust about schools in the 3 new villages. So much to do.